He threw her deed into the mud. Not by accident, not in a moment of careless arrogance. Harlan Briggs chose to do it, pulled the folded paper from Mae Whitaker's hand with two fingers like he was handling something dead, held it out over the puddle left by last night's rain, and dropped it. Then he looked at her face to make sure she saw. "That's what your father's name is worth out here," he said. "Mud." The whole street went quiet. 20, maybe 30 people standing outside Coulter's General Store, and not one of them moved. They just watched. Some of them had known Mae since she was a girl in braids riding the fence line with her daddy. They watched anyway. Mae didn't cry. That was the thing nobody expected. Not Harlan, not the crowd, maybe not even Mae herself. She crouched down in the dirt, peeled the wet deed off the ground with both hands, folded it back along its original creases, and tucked it into her coat pocket without a single word. She walked home alone. If you've ever been the person everyone gave up on, stay with us, because this story belongs to you. Hit that subscribe button and follow Mae's story to the very end, because you will not want to miss what happens next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story has traveled. The Whitaker Ranch sat 2 miles east of Red Hollow on a flat stretch of land that the old-timers called the Scald, a name that told you everything about what grew there, which was almost nothing. The soil cracked in summer and flooded in the wet months and did neither thing with any particular grace. Mae's father, Gerald Whitaker, had worked that land for 31 years on the faith that it would eventually reward him, which was the kind of faith that could build a man's whole life and then quietly break it. He died in March, 14 months before this story begins. The ranch passed to Mae because she was the only one left to pass it to. Her mother had been gone for 11 years. Her brother Calvin had ridden north to Wyoming when he was 19 and sent 3 letters in the first year, and then nothing after that. The lawyer in town, a small man named Prescott with a permanent squint, had read her the terms of the estate in a voice that suggested the whole business was slightly beneath him. The terms were not generous. Gerald had borrowed against the land twice in his last years, once to fix the well casing and once for reasons Mae didn't fully understand, something to do with cattle prices and a bad season. What she inherited was the land, the house, 2 aging horses, a barn with a leaking roof, and a debt owed to the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Briggs. That name, Harlan Briggs, was the first thing Prescott said that made Mae pay close attention. "He holds the note," Prescott said, not looking up from his papers. 90 days from today is the first scheduled review." Mae had nodded like she understood what review meant in this context. She hadn't entirely. She did by the time 90 days passed. Harlan Briggs was not technically a banker. I was a man who had purchased a failing bank 12 years earlier, restructured its lending terms, and proceeded to accumulate land and livestock from the people who could not meet those terms. In Red Hollow, he was called successful, which was the word people used for a man who had money when they needed some. His cattle operation covered 4,000 acres north of town. His name was on the feed store and on a sign above the door of the bank, and Mae would come to understand, on the backside of every important agreement in the county. He wasn't cruel the way a storybook villain is cruel, with sneering and dramatic declarations. He was something more ordinary than that, and more dangerous. He was a man who had simply decided that the rules were for people without leverage, and he applied that belief with the steady, patient efficiency of someone who had never once been wrong. Mae spent her first 60 days on the ranch in a state that she would later describe as controlled panic. She didn't tell anyone in town that she was struggling, partly because pride runs deep in families that have worked the same ground for 3 decades, and partly because she'd already seen how Red Hollow treated weakness. She'd watched what happened to the Creighton widow 2 winters ago. The careful reduction of a person, joke by joke, until showing up in public felt like an act of courage. She wasn't ready for that. So she worked. She woke before light and assessed everything she had. She walked the property line 3 days in a row with a notebook and wrote down what she saw. Where the fence posts had rotted through, where the soil changed color along the eastern edge, where water pooled after rain in a shallow depression near the old equipment shed. She cataloged the tools in the barn, the condition of the tack, the temperament of the horses, one steady, one unpredictable, both underfed. She also cataloged what she didn't have: working irrigation, a crop in the ground, a herd worth mentioning, or any clear plan that could generate income before Harlan Briggs came to review the note. On day 63, he came early. Mae was at the water pump behind the house when she heard horses on the road. She knew before she saw him. There was something about the sound of Briggs's approach, the particular self-assurance of it, like the land itself was expected to adjust for his passage. He rode in with two men she didn't know and dismounted without being invited. "Miss Whitaker," he said, using the title in a way that somehow wasn't respectful. "Thought I'd come out and see how you were getting on." "I've got 27 days left," Mae said. He smiled at that. "You've been counting." "I've been keeping track, yes." He walked past her toward the barn, hands clasped behind his back, and she followed because it was her property and she wasn't going to stand at the pump while he made a tour of it. He looked at the horses. He looked at the cracked floor of the hay storage. He looked at the eastern field, brown and cracked, through the open barn door. "Your father was a stubborn man," Briggs said. "I respected that about him, even when it cost him." "Don't," Mae said. He turned. "Don't what?" "Don't tell me what you respected about my father." Something shifted in his expression then. Not anger exactly, more like recalibration. He looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of land he's already decided to buy when he realizes the fencing is in worse shape than he thought, adjusting the price down in his head. 27 days, he said pleasantly, and rode back out. That night, Mae sat at her father's kitchen table with a lamp and the deed and her notebook. She had done the arithmetic 7 times by then, and it came out the same every time. She could not make the payment in 27 days. She could not make it in 57. The land was not producing, and she had nothing liquid to sell that would cover what was owed. She sat there until the lamp burned low, and she had to make a decision about the oil. She refilled the lamp. She kept working. What she was working on, and this would matter later enormously, was a set of observations she'd been recording about the Eastern Depression, the place where water pooled after rain. She'd started noticing that the pooling lasted longer than it should, that the soil stayed damp in that spot for 3 or 4 days after the surrounding ground had baked dry again. She'd started digging test holes. She'd started reading everything in her father's small library about groundwater, about soil composition, about what conditions allowed water to collect underground rather than drain away. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. She was sure she was looking. In town, meanwhile, the character of Red Hollow was making itself apparent to her in ways it hadn't when her father was alive to buffer it. People were not unkind, precisely. Kindness would have required engagement, and what most of the town offered Mae was a careful avoidance, the kind that lets a community feel clean-handed when things go badly for someone. She bought supplies at Coulter's and people nodded and moved away. She asked at the feed store about credit terms, and the answer was polite and definitive and no. Martha Ingle at the post office was the only one who spoke to her like she was a person. Martha was 62 and had outlived 2 husbands and had opinions about everything, which she delivered in a steady murmur while sorting envelopes. "You know what your problem is," Martha said one afternoon. "I have a feeling you'll tell me. You came back to that land alone and you're too proud to look like you're struggling." Martha handed her a piece of mail. "And this town smells struggle like a dog smells fear. They can't help it. It's the nature of the place." "What do you suggest?" "I suggest you find something that works before you run out of time to find it." Martha went back to her sorting. "And I suggest you stop buying flour in single-pound portions. It makes you look desperate." Mae bought a 5-pound sack on the way home and put it in the pantry and stood in front of it for a while, feeling something between gratitude and embarrassment. She was back at the Depression 2 mornings later with a longer iron rod and a jar to collect soil samples, when she heard voices coming up the old ranch road. Not Briggs's deliberate approach, but something less organized, more social. She stood up and saw 4 men she recognized from town, one of them the younger Coulter son, walking the fence line and talking loudly. They stopped when they saw her. "Miss Whitaker," the Coulter boy said, grinning in the way young men grin when they have an audience. "Planting something?" "Test holes," she said. "Test holes." He repeated it back to his companions like it was the funniest thing he'd heard this week. "You hear that? She's testing the holes." She picked up her rod and her jar and walked back toward the house. And behind her she heard the laughter spread across all 4 of them like something contagious. It didn't stop when she was out of earshot. She knew this because she'd learned that in Red Hollow, laughter about a particular person had a way of traveling faster than the person could walk. By the time she reached town 2 days later for her regular supply run, it had already become a small story. The Whitaker woman out in the back field with a stick, testing holes in dirt that was already dead. People didn't say it to her face, but she heard the shape of it in the space around her, in the way conversations paused when she walked past and resumed when she was beyond earshot. Harlan Briggs heard it too. She could tell by the way he looked at her when she passed the bank. Not cruelty, but satisfaction, which was harder to bear. On the 23rd day before the note was due, something changed. She had been digging in the Eastern Depression again, in the early morning, when her rod struck something different. Not the resistant crack of dry clay or the soft give of loose fill, but a sound that carried up through the metal and into her palms like a note being held. She hit it again, same sound. She dropped to her knees and started digging with her hands, pulling away the topsoil in handfuls, and 4 inches down the earth was cold and dark and damp, in a way that the surrounding land was not. She sat back on her heels and looked at the hole. She dug 3 more holes that morning, each one 20 feet from the last in a rough pattern around the original. 3 of the 4 came up damp. The 4th was dry, but she was already doing math, the kind that felt different from all the other math she'd been doing. Not the grinding arithmetic of debt and shortfall, but something that opened instead of closed. She wasn't certain. She needed to be certain. She covered the holes, marked each one with a small stone, and went inside to go through her father's papers again, looking for anything he might have written about the eastern field. She found it in the back of a ledger from 9 years ago. 2 lines in Gerald Whitaker's careful hand. Water table rose this season, Eastern Depression holding, noted for next year, and then nothing in any ledger after that, as if he'd written it down and then set it aside and never went back. Mae closed the ledger and pressed both hands flat on the table. Her father had seen it, and he'd never followed through. She went back out in the afternoon and dug another 6 holes, and 4 of those were damp. She spent the next 3 days mapping the moisture pattern across 40 yards of the eastern edge, and what emerged, imperfect, rough, but undeniably there, was a shape, an underground shape. Water that had been moving through this land all along, slow and hidden, while everyone above ground watched the surface die. She didn't tell anyone. She needed to know if she could reach it, if she could use it, before she said a word to another living person in Red Hollow. She also needed to figure out how she was going to make the payment. Those 2 problems did not solve each other in the time she had. On the day Harlan Briggs rode into town for his formal review, Mae was standing outside Coulter's General Store buying a bag of nails. He dismounted at the bank down the street and looked toward her, and whatever he saw on her face, and she tried to keep it flat, tried to give him nothing. Whatever he saw made him take his time. He spoke to his companion first. He tied his horse with deliberate care. He adjusted his coat. Then he walked toward her. The street wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. Mrs. Fallon from the laundry was sweeping her step. 2 men she didn't know were sitting outside the hardware store. The Coulter boy was visible through the store window. Briggs stopped 3 feet from her and spoke at a volume that carried. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I'm afraid today's the day." Mae said, "I know what day it is." "Then you know you're in default." He said it gently, which was the worst part. "I know I'm short," she said. "I'd like to discuss an extension." An extension? His tone suggested she'd said something charmingly naive. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I have identified a water source on the eastern portion of the property that changes the land's value substantially, and that I need 60 days to develop it enough to demonstrate what it can produce." There was a pause. Briggs looked at her for a moment in a way that she couldn't quite read. Then he said, "A water source." "Yes." "On the Scald." "Yes." He didn't laugh. She had expected him to laugh, and he didn't, which told her something. Instead, he looked past her toward the eastern horizon, like he was calculating, and when he looked back at her, his expression had smoothed into something careful. "I tell you what," he said, still at that carrying volume, still with the whole street listening whether they looked like it or not. "You bring me proof of this water source in 7 days." Not because she hadn't tried to sleep. She'd lain down on the narrow bed in the back room for what felt like an hour, staring at the ceiling boards while her mind kept turning over the same set of problems the way a wheel turns in mud, spinning without traction. Eventually, she'd stopped pretending and gone back to the table, and that was where the morning found her, surrounded by her father's old survey papers and her own rough sketches and a cold cup of coffee she didn't remember making. The notebook in front of her had 12 pages of notes now. Measurements, estimates, a crude drawing of the Eastern Depression with the moisture locations marked by small X's. Below that, a list of what she needed and what she had, and the gap between those two things, which was considerable. She needed a way to prove the water wasn't just surface moisture from the rain. She needed something that would show Briggs, show anyone, that what she'd found was a genuine underground source and not the desperate imaginings of a woman who'd run out of options. 7 days was not a long time to build a case. It was not a long time to dig a proper well. It was barely enough time to establish that the water was consistently there, that it came back after you pulled it out, that it behaved the way underground water behaves rather than the way muddy hope behaves. She needed equipment she didn't have. She needed materials from the hardware store, which required money she didn't have. She needed, at minimum, someone who knew more about well digging than she did, which was a low bar but still a bar she hadn't yet cleared. She was still sitting there working through this when she heard a horse on the road. It wasn't Briggs's sound. She knew that already, had already cataloged the particular deliberate rhythm of his approach. This was something different. A single horse, moving at a pace that wasn't hurried but wasn't casual either. The sound of someone who had somewhere specific to be and was going there without wasting motion. Mae didn't get up. She heard the horse stop outside. She heard boots on the ground, then on her porch steps, and then a knock. Not the loud, demanding knock of a man who expects to be let in, but a solid, even knock. The kind that waits. She opened the door. The man standing on her porch was not anyone she recognized, which itself was notable in a county where she'd grown up knowing most faces, if not most names. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she guessed, with a road-worn quality to him that wasn't quite the same as being dirty, more like someone who'd spent enough time outdoors that the outdoors had become the default state, and everything else was temporary. He had a hat in his hands, which he'd taken off without being asked, and a saddle pack slung over one shoulder. "Mae Whitaker?" he said. "Who's asking?" "Cole Mercer." He said without any particular expectation that the name would mean something to her, which she appreciated. "I rode in last night, took a room at the Hollis place on the edge of town. Fellow there mentioned your ranch." "What fellow?" "Older man, runs a post office." Mae thought about that. Martha Ingalls' husband was a tall, quiet man who ran the post office counter in the mornings while Martha sorted. He had never said more than 4 words to Mae directly. She couldn't quite picture him mentioning her to a stranger. "What did he mention?" she said. "Said there was a ranch east of town that was in a fight and might need an extra hand." Cole Mercer shifted the pack on his shoulder slightly. "I know land work, water systems, irrigation, digging. I've worked ranches from here to the Colorado Territory." Mae looked at him for a moment. He didn't fidget under the look, which was either confidence or practice. She couldn't tell which yet. "I can't pay you," she said. "Mr. Ingle mentioned that too." "Then I don't understand what you're doing on my porch." Cole Mercer looked past her into the house for a moment. Not rudely, but the way a person looks when they're trying to understand the full shape of a situation. "Can I see the land?" She should have said no. The rational calculation of her situation did not include trusting a stranger who'd appeared on her doorstep based on the vague referral of a man she barely knew. But she'd been alone with these problems for 60-some days, and she was running short on options, and the notebooks on the table behind her weren't going to dig themselves into the Eastern Depression. "Come around back," she said. She walked him out to the Eastern Depression without explaining much on the way. She wanted to see what he saw without telling him what to see. That felt important. She'd been told by enough people that this land was dead that she needed one unprompted observation from someone who didn't have a stake in the answer. He crouched down at the first hole she'd marked with a stone, pressed his fingers into the soil, held them there. Then he moved to the second marker and did the same thing. He was quiet for a long time. "How far down does it get damp?" he said finally. 4 inches at the shallowest, 8 or 9 in the middle of the pattern. "And it came back after the rain?" "The rain was 4 days ago. It's still here." He stood up and looked at the rough oval shape of the marked area, maybe 40 feet across at its widest. He looked north, then east, following some line of reasoning she couldn't see yet. "There's a limestone shelf under most of this county," he said. "Not continuous. It breaks up toward the eastern edge, which is why most of the ranches over here have had trouble with wells. You hit limestone at 12 feet, and you're done unless you've got the equipment to go through it. He paused. But if the shelf breaks, and you're sitting on top of a gap in it, the water table comes up, sometimes significantly. Mae said, "How would I prove that in 7 days?" He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him registering the 7 days, understanding that this wasn't theoretical, that there was a clock attached to this conversation. "You'd need to dig a test shaft," he said, 2 feet wide, go down until you hit standing water. If you hit it, you collect it, measure the recovery rate over 48 hours. That tells you if it's a real source or just perched moisture. I need equipment for that. Some. Not as much as a full well. Do you have a decent spade and a post hole digger? I have both. Wood for casing? Anything to keep the shaft from collapsing? There's timber in the barn. Then you have most of what matters. He looked at the depression again. The rest is time and muscle. Mae crossed her arms. She was trying to work out what this man wanted, because in her experience, people didn't show up with labor and knowledge and no stated price without wanting something, and she preferred to know what that something was before she was in too deep to negotiate. "Why?" she said. He looked back at her. "Why what? Why ride out here for no pay to dig holes in someone else's land?" Cole Mercer was quiet for a moment, and she got the sense he was deciding how honest to be. Not in a calculating way, more in the way people pause before saying something true that's harder to say than something easy. "I've worked for men like Harlan Briggs before," he said. 3 different operations in 2 different territories. I know how that story goes. He glanced toward the marked holes. "I'd rather help write a different one." It wasn't the whole answer, she could tell that, but it was a true piece of it, and she'd learned to take true pieces when that's what was available. "We start at first light tomorrow," she said. "I'll feed you while you're working." "That's fair," he said. He tipped his head and went back around the house to his horse, and Mae stood in the eastern depression for another minute, looking at her marked stones, feeling the strange combination of relief and new anxiety that comes from no longer being entirely alone with a problem. The next morning, he was there before she was. She came out at first light with coffee in 2 cups, and he was already at the depression with his own tools. A heavier spade than hers, a collapsible casing frame she didn't recognize, and a leather-wrapped kit that turned out to contain measuring equipment. He'd been working for maybe 30 minutes already and had stripped out the topsoil from a 2-foot circle down to a depth of about 18 inches. Mae handed him a cup without comment. He took it, drank, handed it back, and kept working. She picked up her own spade and got in beside him. They worked through the morning. The soil resisted in layers, loose topsoil giving way to a compressed clay layer that took real effort, and below that something grittier, more mixed, that came out in clumps and smelled faintly different from the clay above. Around mid-morning, Cole stopped and crouched over the hole. "Feel this," he said. Mae knelt beside him. The soil from the most recent foot of digging was between his fingers, and he held it out to her. She took a pinch. It was cold. Not cool in the way deep soil is often cool, genuinely cold, and when she pressed it between her fingers, damp. "You're not imagining it," Cole said, which was not a thing he could have known she needed to hear, but he was right that she needed to hear it. They kept going. By early afternoon, they had a shaft down to 4 feet, and at 4 feet and 3 inches, the bottom of the hole was wet. Not flooding, not a gusher, but wet in a way that didn't drain away when they scooped it out, in a way that returned within 20 minutes of being cleared. Cole measured the recovery rate with a small tin cup and a pocket watch, and wrote the numbers down without saying anything. Mae watched him write and kept her face neutral, which required more effort than she wanted to admit. "That's a real source," he said finally. Mae said, "How real?" "Real enough that if you developed it properly, proper well casing, appropriate depth, pump equipment, you'd have consistent water, not river water, but enough for irrigation of a defined acreage." He looked at his numbers again. "Enough to make this land worth something." Mae sat back on her heels and looked at the small, wet hole at the bottom of the shaft, and thought about her father writing 2 lines in a ledger 9 years ago and then closing the book. She thought about 31 years of working the scald on the faith that it would reward patience, and whether her father had been more right than he ever knew, and whether that was a kind thought or an unbearable one. She decided it was both and moved on. "I need to document this in a way Briggs can't dismiss," she said. Written measurements, dated, recovery rates, a second opinion if I can get one. Who else in this county knows water systems? There's a man named Aldous Reeve who surveyed some of the northern ranges 3 years ago. He's semi-retired, lives about 8 miles out. Could you get him out here in the next 5 days? I don't know. He doesn't owe me anything. Cole looked at her steadily. You'd have to ask. I know I'd have to ask, she said with an edge she didn't mean to put there. I'm aware of the mechanics of asking. He didn't react to the edge. I'll keep measuring here. You should go see Reeve tomorrow. The next morning, Mae rode the 8 miles to Aldous Reeve's property, which was a neat, worn-down place with a carefully tended kitchen garden and 3 dogs that announced her arrival with considerable enthusiasm. Reeve himself came to the door in a canvas work jacket, a man in his late 60s with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent decades reading landscapes and learned that most things revealed themselves if you waited. She explained the situation plainly. She didn't dress it up or ask for sympathy. She laid out what she'd found, what she'd measured, what she needed documented, and what the timeline was. Reeve listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Briggs? Yes. He's been after that parcel. Mae said, He hasn't said that. He wouldn't. Reeve looked past her at the horizon for a moment. 30 years I've watched that man build his operation, and I can tell you how he does it. He waits. He lets people get into trouble, and then he makes the terms seem reasonable, and by the time a person understands what they've agreed to, it's already done. He refocused on her. Your father wasn't the first. She kept her face still. Will you come? Reeve was quiet for a long moment. His dogs circled once and settled. Day after tomorrow, he said. I've got work I can't leave tomorrow. Day after tomorrow, Mae said. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. If what you've got isn't what you think it is, I'll say so. That's all I'm asking. She rode home in the late afternoon with 3 days left before Briggs's deadline, which was either enough time or it wasn't, and she wouldn't know which until it was nearly over. Cole had kept measuring through the day she was gone. When she got back, he was sitting on the equipment shed steps with his notebook and a look on his face that she'd started to be able to read. Not emotions exactly, more like the shifting of variables in a calculation. Recovery rates increasing, he said. Not dramatically, but consistently. Each measurement cycle is coming back a little faster than the last. Is that good? It means we're pulling from something that has pressure behind it, not just a trapped pool. He showed her the numbers. This is a connected source. It's getting fed from somewhere else. Mae studied the numbers. She wasn't an engineer, she'd never formally studied water systems. But she'd spent enough time with her father's land, with its rhythms and failures, that she could feel when a pattern in the data reflected something real rather than something she wanted to be real. This felt real. When Reeve comes, she said, don't talk first. Let him look and draw his own conclusions. Cole glanced at her. You don't trust me to give him the right impression? I trust you, she said, and was slightly surprised to find she meant it, at least provisionally. I don't want anyone to have the impression of anything. I want him to see what's there and say what he sees. Cole nodded. Understood. They ate that evening at the kitchen table, a spare meal, beans and cornbread and coffee, the kind of food that's honest rather than generous. Cole didn't seem to expect more. He ate without complaint, and when he was done, he helped clear the dishes, which was not a thing she'd asked him to do, and that small, unremarkable act landed differently than she expected. Tell me about Briggs, he said when they were both back at the table with the second cup of coffee. Not the public version, what you've actually seen of him. Mae considered. He's patient, she said. Most people who want something are obvious about it. Briggs isn't. He comes at things sideways. She turned her cup in her hands. The day he dropped my deed in the mud, that wasn't anger. He wasn't losing control. He did it on purpose, in public, at a specific volume, to establish something. She paused. He wanted the town to see me bend down and pick it up. Did he get what he wanted? I picked it up. She set down the cup. What he didn't get was what he expected to see on my face when I did it. Cole looked at her. What did he see? Nothing, Mae said. He saw nothing, because I decided right at that moment that he was done seeing anything on my face. Cole was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up slightly and moved through something dry. A fence post, maybe, or the loose board on the barn she'd been meaning to fix. Small sounds in a quiet night. He's going to try to claim the water, Cole said. Once he knows it's real, he'll find a way to say the note covers subsurface rights or that the land value adjustment means the terms change. I know. The documentation needs to be airtight, dated, witnessed, specific. I know that too. Reeve alone might not be enough. Mae said, then I need a lawyer who isn't Prescott. Cole said, there's a man in Colebrook, 20 miles east. His name is Weston Farr, and he's handled water rights cases before. I don't know his current situation. Mae filed the name. How do you know about him? I did some reading before I came out here. She looked at him. You researched this county before you rode in. I researched Briggs, he said simply. I wanted to know what I was dealing with. The information sat between them for a moment. It changed the shape of things. Not negatively, she decided, but the change needed to be accounted for. Cole Mercer had not ridden in by chance. He had come deliberately, with preparation, toward a situation he'd identified. Why? She said again. The same question she'd asked in the field, which he'd given her a partial answer to. He turned his cup slowly. 8 years ago, he said, my mother had a ranch in the Southern Territory. Not unlike this one. Dry land, small operation, more work than income. He paused. Man named Colton Adder held her note. Same pattern as Briggs, patient, sideways, public pressure. He took the land 2 months before a water survey would have shown there was an aquifer on the property. Another pause. She never recovered it. Mae said, I'm sorry. I don't want sorry, he said not harshly. I want this one to go differently. That was the most she'd heard him say at one time, and she understood it was more than he usually offered. She didn't push at it. She said goodnight, and he went out to the barn where he'd been sleeping on a bedroll, and she sat at the table a little longer, thinking about all the versions of this story that existed across this territory, all the quiet takings, all the people who bent down and picked things up and walked home and didn't recover. She wasn't going to be another version of that story. Aldous Reeve arrived 2 days later in the mid-morning. He brought his own instruments, a proper surveying level, a soil testing kit in a wooden box, a long brass probe that he'd clearly built or modified himself. He said hello to Mae and looked at Cole with a neutral assessment and said nothing, and then he went to the Eastern Depression and spent 2 hours working without comment. Mae and Cole stood back and let him work. At one point, Mae heard herself start to say something, and Cole put his hand briefly on her arm. Just a touch, just a second. And she stopped. He was right. She waited. When Reeve finally straightened and came back to where they stood, he was wiping his hands on a cloth, and his expression had shifted into something more engaged than when he'd arrived. You've got a confined aquifer, he said, directly to Mae. Relatively shallow, which is unusual for this part of the county. The limestone shelf breaks about 100 yards northeast of here, and there's a natural channel running roughly south. Your depression is sitting right above the lowest point of that channel. He tucked the cloth in his pocket. The pressure I'm reading suggests the source extends significantly, maybe into the adjacent properties to the north. Mae registered that. The properties to the north. Briggs's range. Can you put that in writing? She said. I can write up a formal survey assessment, dated and signed. Reeve looked toward the shaft they'd dug. Who's seen this besides you two? No one. Keep it that way until you have paper in hand. He looked at her squarely. Briggs has friends in the county records office. If word gets out before you've filed something formally, things have a way of getting complicated. How long for your written assessment? I can have it done by tomorrow evening. 1 day left on Briggs's deadline. Mae did the arithmetic. I need it by tomorrow morning. Reeve looked at her for a moment, then at the hole, then back at her. He seemed to be assessing something in her that wasn't the water. Tonight then, he said. I'll have my daughter write it out. I'll pay you. When you're on solid ground, he said. Not before. He left. Mae stood in the eastern field with the afternoon light starting to lengthen. 1 day left on a 7-day clock, the aquifer survey coming, Briggs's meeting tomorrow, and no lawyer. Colebrook, she said. Cole said, It's 20 miles. I know how far it is. Can you ride tonight? He looked at her. To find Farr. To find Farr. Bring him back if he'll come. If he won't come, get his terms and his fastest turnaround for a review of water rights documentation in this county. Cole picked up his jacket from where it was sitting on the fence post. I'll need to leave in the next hour to get there before dark. The roan is steadier than the bay, Mae said. Take the roan. He took the roan. Mae watched him ride east until the light swallowed him, and then she went inside and sat at the table and reread every note she'd taken over the past week, looking for weaknesses in the documentation, things Briggs's people could challenge, gaps that needed filling before morning. She found 3. Spent 2 hours filling them with additional notes, more precise measurements, the kind of redundancy that made a document hard to pick apart. At 11 o'clock, Reeves' daughter knocked on the door with a sealed envelope. She was a quiet young woman who handed it over without ceremony, said her father wished Mae well, and left. Mae opened the envelope. Read the assessment twice. It was precise, professional, and unambiguous. Aldous Reeve had been surveying land in this county for 40 years, and the document read like it. No hedging, no qualifications beyond the technically necessary, just a clean statement of what was in the ground. She added it to her folder and kept working. Cole came back at 2 in the morning. She heard the roan on the road and went to the door. He came up the steps with road dust on him and a look on his face that she couldn't immediately read. "Far's in Colebrook," he said. "He'll come, but not tomorrow. He can be here day after tomorrow." "That's a day past the deadline." "I know." He came inside and sat down heavily. But he said something worth hearing. He said water rights in this territory are established by discovery and use, not by the terms of a debt note. If you can demonstrate prior discovery, dated documentation, the aquifer isn't covered by Briggs's note regardless of how the terms are written. Mae sat down across from him. "He said that definitively?" "He said it's the relevant statute, and he'd stake his practice on it." Cole looked at the folder on the table. "Is that Reeves' assessment?" "Yes." "Does it have dates?" "Dated, signed, and witnessed by Reeves' daughter." Cole looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. "Then you have prior discovery," he said. "You have dated documentation of a water source on your property, independent of the debt terms." He leaned back. "Briggs can enforce the note. He can come and demand payment tomorrow, and you still might lose the ranch if you can't make a counter-argument in time. But he cannot legally fold the aquifer rights into the note." Mae said, "He might try anyway." "He will definitely try anyway." "Then I need Far here faster." "He said day after tomorrow is the earliest." "You told him the timeline." "He knows the timeline." Cole looked at her steadily. "He's coming as fast as he can, Mae." It was the first time he'd used her name without the title, and she noticed it but said nothing about it. She thought for a long minute. Outside, the wind had died and the night was very still, the kind of still that in this country meant either nothing or everything, weather-wise, and you didn't always know which until morning. "Then I meet Briggs tomorrow," she said. "I show him Reeves' assessment. I tell him I'm prepared to file a formal water rights claim and that I have legal representation coming to advise on the documentation. I don't give him the full picture. I give him enough to make him cautious." "He might call your bluff." "He might, but Briggs is a patient man. Patient men don't like uncertainty. If he thinks there's a legal complication he hasn't accounted for, he'll want time to look at it. He won't want to move against the property and then find himself in a water rights dispute that complicates his title." Cole looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and his face in that light had the quality of someone who was deciding something. "You've thought about this man a lot," he said. "I've thought about nothing else for 7 days," she said. "I've thought about him for 63 days before that." "You're not afraid of him?" It wasn't quite a question. Mae considered it seriously rather than dismissing it, because she wanted to be accurate. "I'm afraid of losing the land," she said. "That's real. That's a real fear. But Briggs himself—" She paused. "He's a man who's built his power on other people's fear of him. Once you understand that, he's less impressive." She closed the folder. "He needs me afraid. The moment he stops getting that from me, he has to find another approach." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." "I know." She stood up. "Take the back room. The barn's cold at this hour, and I need you functional tomorrow." He looked like he was going to argue, and she gave him the same flat expression she'd been practicing for Briggs, and he seemed to decide that arguing was unnecessary. She took the chair by the table and pulled her coat over herself and closed her eyes. She didn't expect to sleep, and she was right. She drifted in and out of something thin and restless until the sky started to gray. While in the back room, she could hear the even, unbothered breathing of a man who had, Apparently, the gift of sleeping soundly in the middle of other people's crises. She was almost annoyed by it. She was also, in the strange quiet of that almost morning, less alone than she'd been in 14 months, and she held that fact carefully, the way you hold something that might break if you grip it too hard. The sun came up. The day came with it. Harlan Briggs would be in town by mid-morning. Mae Whitaker put on her cleanest shirt, her father's good coat, and the boots she kept for occasions that required them. She picked up the folder. She looked around the kitchen at the notebooks and the lamp and the deed on the table, the one she'd pulled from the mud. She folded the deed and put it in her pocket. Cole was already up, already in the yard with the horses, and when she came out he handed her the reins of the bay without comment. His face in the morning light was steady. "Ready?" he said. She mounted, straightened, looked down the road toward Red Hollow. "Let's go," she said. They rode into Red Hollow at 9:30 in the morning. The town was already moving, wagons at the feed store, women at the dry goods, the usual morning traffic that gave Red Hollow its illusion of being a place where things were happening. Mae rode straight down the center of the main street without hurrying, the folder tucked inside her coat against her ribs, Cole half a length behind her on the roan. She didn't look at anyone directly. She didn't look away either. She rode like she had somewhere specific to be, which she did. Briggs' bank sat at the north end of the street, a two-story building with a painted sign and shuttered upper windows. His horse was already tied outside, along with two others she recognized as belonging to men who worked his range. He'd brought company. She'd expected that. She dismounted and tied the bay and looked at the building for one moment, just one, and then she went inside. The front room of the bank was a plain space. 2 chairs, a counter, a man behind it she didn't know. Briggs was in the back office. She could hear his voice through the closed door, talking to someone, easy and unhurried, the way a man talks when he's certain of the outcome of the day. She sat in one of the chairs. Cole stood near the door. The man behind the counter looked at Cole with the particular assessment men gave to strangers in places where they thought they knew everyone. "Can I help you?" he said. "We're waiting," Cole said. "Mr. Briggs is in a meeting." "We're still waiting," Cole said pleasantly, and said nothing else. The voice in the back office continued for another 4 minutes. Mae counted, and then the door opened and Harlan Briggs came out with a younger man she didn't recognize, some kind of associate, judging by the way he deferred to the angle of Briggs's shoulder. Briggs saw Mae and stopped. His eyes moved to Cole, registered him, moved back to Mae. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "you saved me a ride." "I thought I'd come to you," she said, "since you set the meeting." He gestured toward the back office with the ease of a man on his own ground. "Come in." She went in. Cole followed. Briggs's eyes tracked Cole again, but he didn't say anything about it, which she noted. He was deciding whether to object and choosing not to, which meant he was still assessing. The back office had a desk and 3 chairs and a window that looked out at the alley behind the building. Briggs sat behind the desk. Mae sat across from him. Cole stood to her left, which put him in Briggs's peripheral vision without being directly confrontational. Briggs put both hands on the desk. "You're in default, Miss Whitaker. Today is the day I specified." "I know what day it is," she said, the same words she'd used 8 days ago, the same level tone. "I'd like to present you with something before we proceed." "I don't believe there's much to present." She took the folder from inside her coat and set it on the desk. She didn't push it toward him. She just set it there. "That is a formal survey assessment," she said, "conducted by Aldous Reeve, county surveyor, 4 decades experience, dated 2 days ago. It documents a confined aquifer on the eastern portion of the Whitaker property, a connected water source with measurable pressure and recovery rate. The survey establishes discovery and initial documentation of a subsurface water right." Briggs looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "And I am informing you," Mae continued, "that I have engaged a water rights attorney, Weston Farr of Colebrook, who will be on site the day after tomorrow to review the documentation and advise on formal filing." The room was quiet. Outside in the front room, she could hear the man behind the counter moving papers. Briggs picked up the folder, opened it, read, which she appreciated because it told her he was taking it seriously. He read it slowly, which told her he was finding things in it he hadn't expected to find. He closed it. "Reeve," he said. "Yes. He's getting old." "His survey methodology is meticulous," Mae said, "and his findings are corroborated by 3 days of independent measurement documentation, which I also have copies of. Briggs set the folder down and looked at her with a different expression than he'd used before. Not the amused tolerance, not the gentle condescension. Something cooler, something that was recalculating. "You're still in default," he said. "I am. And I'm asking for a 30-day extension on the basis that the property's value has materially changed given the discovery of a subsurface water right, and that the legal status of that right as it relates to the debt note requires review before any transfer of title would be clean." She watched him hear the word clean. That was the word Cole had suggested last night. Not clean as in honest, but clean as in legally unencumbered. A man like Briggs didn't want complicated title. He wanted clear title. If there was a water rights claim attached to the property that he hadn't accounted for, any transfer he executed would carry that complication with it. He knew this. She could see him knowing it. 30 days, he said. 30 days. He looked at Cole. "And who is this?" "Cole Mercer," Cole said. "I'm working the Whitaker ranch." "Doing what exactly?" "Whatever needs doing." Briggs looked at him for a moment with the careful appraisal of a man who had handled a lot of people and could usually read them quickly. Cole gave him nothing to read. His face was the same steady neutral it usually was. Not aggressive, not deferential, just present. "You rode in recently," Briggs said. It wasn't a question. "Last week," Cole said. "From where?" "Various places," Cole said pleasantly. Briggs's jaw tightened slightly, barely perceptible, but Mae caught it. He didn't like not being able to place people. He worked in a world where knowing someone's history meant knowing their leverage and their weaknesses, and a man who came from various places was a man he couldn't immediately categorize. Briggs turned back to Mae. "I'll need to have this survey reviewed by my own people." "That's your right," Mae said. "And if my review finds Reeves' assessment overstated, then we'll have a difference of professional opinion," Mae said, "which a court would need to resolve, which would take considerably longer than 30 days and would put the title in question for that entire duration." The word court sat in the room like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to move around. Briggs picked up the folder again, tapped it once on the desk, set it back down. "I'll give you 14 days, he said. 30, Mae said. 20. She looked at him. She had anticipated this negotiation in the dark last night, running it forward in her mind, trying to see where it would go. She'd identified the number she could accept and the number she could not. And 20 was above the minimum, but she wasn't going to take the first counter. 25, she said. Briggs looked at her for a long time. She held his eyes without expression, without animosity, without anything he could read and use. 25 days, he said, and I'll send my own surveyor to the property within the week. You'll give him access. Appropriate access, Mae said. Accompanied. Another pause. Fine. She stood, picked up the folder from his desk. She hadn't left it with him. She'd presented it, and tucked it back inside her coat. I'll have Farr send you a formal notice of representation when he arrives. Briggs stayed seated, which was a choice. Miss Whitaker, he said when she was almost at the door. She turned. You've bought yourself some time, he said, not unkindly. That's all this is. That's all I asked for, she said. She walked back through the front room. Cole fell into step beside her, and she didn't look at him until they were outside and on their horses and a full block away. And then she looked straight ahead down the road and let out a long, slow breath through her nose. 25 days, Cole said. 25 days, she said. Is that enough? It has to be. The town watched them ride out. She felt the watching. Red Hollow had a particular quality of attention that you could feel on the back of your neck, and she felt it now, the curiosity and the calculation, people trying to work out what had happened inside that building and what it meant for the shape of things. Let them wonder, she thought. Let them try to read it. Weston Farr arrived the following afternoon, 2 days ahead of the schedule Cole had given, which suggested he'd rearrange something to come sooner. He was a compact man in his 50s with a precise manner and papers in his case that he clearly knew the contents of. And he spent the first hour of his visit at the Eastern Depression with Reeves' survey and his own copies of the relevant territorial statutes. Then he sat down at Mae's kitchen table and was direct. The water right is defensible, he said. Discovery is dated and witnessed. Under territorial statute, a subsurface water right, established by discovery, belongs to the surface landowner and cannot be transferred by debt note, unless the note specifically enumerated subsurface mineral and water rights at the time of signing. He looked at Mae. Did your father's note include such enumeration? Prescott drew up the note, Mae said. Do you know him? Farr's expression said something without his mouth saying it. I know of him. Did you bring a copy of the note? She had. She slid it across the table. Farr read it in less than 2 minutes. There's no subsurface enumeration, he said. Standard note language. Briggs either didn't think to add it, or he didn't know about the aquifer when the note was written. He set the document down. He knows now. He's sending his own surveyor. Of course he is, and his surveyor will confirm what Reeve found because it's there. You can't dispute the geology. What he'll try to do instead is argue that the note's standard collateral clause is broad enough to cover the water right by implication. Farr straightened the papers in front of him. It isn't, but he'll argue it. Can he win that argument? Not in a territorial court that applies the statute correctly. Farr looked at her steadily. But courts in small counties sometimes apply statutes in ways that reflect local relationships. I want to be honest with you about that. Mae appreciated the honesty the way she'd appreciated Reeve's honesty, not because it was comfortable, but because it was real. What do I need to do? File a formal water rights claim with the territorial recorder. Today, if possible. That establishes a date of record that precedes any counterfiling Briggs might make. He opened his case and produced a form. I brought the paperwork. Cole drove them to the territorial recorder's office in Millhaven, the county seat, 18 miles west. They filed at 4:15 in the afternoon, and the clerk stamped the date on the form with the impersonal efficiency of someone who processed dozens of these a week, and had no idea this particular one mattered. Mae took her copy of the stamped filing and held it in her hands in the buggy on the way back, and didn't say much for the first several miles. Cole let her be quiet. He drove and watched the road and didn't fill the silence with words it didn't need. After a while, she said, He's going to come at this from another direction. Probably, Cole said. The surveyor visit. He'll use it. How? I don't know yet. She looked at the filed claim in her hands. But he didn't get to where he is by accepting the first obstacle. He'll find an angle I haven't thought of. She was right. She just didn't know which angle it would be until Briggs's surveyor arrived 4 days later and spent an afternoon on the property, and she watched him with the careful attention she gave to all of Briggs's people. The man was professional, thorough, and at one point took measurements along the northern fence line that had nothing to do with the aquifer itself, measurements that tracked the property boundary in a very specific way. She mentioned this to Cole that evening. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Show me exactly where he was standing. She walked him out in the fading light to the northern fence line and showed him the spots where the surveyor had set his stakes. Cole crouched and looked along the line, stood up, looked again. Mae, he said, where does your deed say the northern boundary is? The old oak line, she said. My father's deed says the northern boundary runs along the oak tree line. Show me where those oaks are. She pointed. The oak line ran roughly parallel to the fence, but not identical. There was a gap between the fence and the tree line, maybe 25 feet at its narrowest, wider in places. Who put up this fence? Cole said. I assumed my father. When? She didn't know. She'd never thought about it. Fences on a ranch were like roads. They were there, and you used them, and you didn't necessarily know their origin. If your deed says the oak line and the fence is 25 feet south of the oak line, Cole said carefully, then someone moved the boundary marker at some point. And if Briggs's surveyor is out here measuring that gap, it's because Briggs already knows the fence doesn't match the deed. Mae looked at the gap between the fence and the trees. He's going to claim I've been using land I don't own, she said, or that your father was. That the actual boundary is the oak line, not the fence, and that the occupied land creates some kind of claim issue. That's not how land law works. No, Cole said, but it's how confusion works, and confusion creates delay, and delay is expensive, especially when you're trying to make a payment in 21 days. She stood at the fence line in the cooling evening and felt the shape of it, the long, patient planning of a man who thought in multiple moves simultaneously. Briggs hadn't known about the aquifer when he wrote the note, but he'd done his homework on the property since, and somewhere in that homework he'd found the fence and deed discrepancy, and now he was going to use it not to win outright, but to complicate, to create enough noise that the next 21 days became about defending the property boundary rather than developing the water right. She went back inside and wrote a letter to Farr that night, explaining what she'd seen. Farr's reply came 3 days later. He'd researched the deed history. The fence had been put up by the previous owner, a man named Tullis, who'd sold to Gerald Whitaker 22 years ago. The deed transfer had used the oak line language, which matched the original survey. Tullis had built the fence 4 feet inside the actual boundary for reasons lost to time, possibly to keep clear of the survey stakes, possibly just imprecision. This meant Mae owned the 25 feet between the fence and the oak line. It also meant she'd never formally used it, which created a murky situation regarding whether Briggs could claim some kind of encroachment right based on his northern cattle range coming up to the fence rather than the oak line. Farr's advice: survey the oak line, establish the formal boundary with a new survey, and file that with the recorder as well. More money she didn't have. More days she didn't have. She told Cole at the table that evening. He listened. He'd been doing more of the physical well work during the days she spent on the legal complications. The test shaft was now a proper cased well, 8 feet deep, with consistent water recovery that they'd been documenting every 12 hours. The numbers were good. Better than good, actually. The recovery rate in the 4th week was noticeably stronger than in the 1st, which Farr had explained meant they were pulling water that was actively being replenished from the source. "What does the boundary survey cost?" Cole asked. "Reeve quoted me $60. Cole was quiet. Then he reached into his jacket and put $40 on the table. Mae looked at the money. "No," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "I've been living on your food in your barn for 3 weeks. I'd have spent this money on room and board somewhere else." "That's not the same thing." "Mae." He said her name with a patience that wasn't condescending, just steady. "We are 20 days away from either saving this ranch or losing it. This is not the moment to argue about $40. She sat with it. The money sat on the table between them, not looking like much, looking like everything. "I'll pay you back," she said. I know, he said, and she believed he meant it, and also believed he genuinely didn't care whether she did. Reeve came back and surveyed the oak line in 2 days. Filed that same week. The boundary was now on record at the Territorial Recorder's Office in Mill Haven, with a date stamp that preceded any claim Briggs's people might construct around the fence discrepancy. Briggs's response came faster than she expected. She was in town buying supplies when Prescott the lawyer appeared at her elbow with the particular manner of someone delivering news. He's been asked to deliver and would prefer not to be associated with. He handed her a document without preamble. "From Mr. Briggs's office," he said. She read it on the spot. It was a formal notice asserting that the debt note, while not explicitly enumerating subsurface rights, covered all improvements and natural resources on the property under its collateral language, and that Briggs intended to contest the water rights filing at the territorial level. It also noted that given the recent survey activity indicating boundary uncertainty, the property's clean title could not be guaranteed at this time, and therefore any extension of the note's terms was being reconsidered. Meaning the 25 days might be gone. She folded the document and put it in her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Prescott," she said, and walked to the post office. Martha Ingle looked up when she came in, read something in Mae's face that she didn't comment on directly. Instead, she said, "Coffee's hot in the back." Mae went in the back and drank a cup of coffee standing up, which was something Martha occasionally permitted for people she thought needed it, and told Martha enough of what was happening that Martha understood the shape of it. Martha said, "He's trying to run out your clock." "I know. 14 days left. I know that too." Martha went back to her sorting with the focused energy of someone thinking while their hands moved. After a minute, she said, "You know who else has a water problem right now?" Mae waited. "Hendrick's Dairy, north edge of the county. Their main well went bad, some kind of contamination, I heard. They've been hauling water for the herd for 3 weeks. It's costing them considerable." Martha didn't look up from the mail. "And the Alderman brothers. 2 ranches east of you. Their creek source is running lower every year. Couple more dry seasons and they're in trouble." Mae set down her cup. She looked at Martha's back. "You're saying they need water," she said. "I'm not saying anything," Martha said. "I'm just noting what I've heard." Mae rode home faster than she'd ridden in a while. Cole was at the well when she arrived, measuring the afternoon recovery rate, and she told him what Martha had said while he was still writing down numbers. He stopped writing, looked up at her. "Water agreements," he said. "If I can establish active commercial use of the aquifer, if I have documented agreements with neighboring operations who are using or will use the water, that strengthens the water right beyond the filing alone." She was working it out as she talked. It's not just a claim on paper, it's a functioning resource with established users. That makes contesting it considerably more complicated. "And it generates income," Cole said. She hadn't gotten to that part yet, but yes. "Enough to matter," she said. "Maybe enough to matter for the note." "Hendrick's Dairy first," Cole said. "They're in the most immediate need. That gives you the most leverage to close an agreement quickly." She went to Hendrick's Dairy the next morning. Thomas Hendricks was a large, tired-looking man who met her at his gate with the wariness of someone who'd been having a bad month. His wife was visible in the yard behind him, watching. Mae was direct. She explained the aquifer, the survey, the recovery rates, the filing. She told him what the documentation showed about sustainable yield. She proposed a water-sharing agreement. She would develop a pipeline to the property line, and Hendricks would extend it to his dairy operation, and she would charge a fee below what he was currently spending on water hauling. Hendricks looked at her for a long time. "Whitaker land," he said. "Yes." "People say that land is no good." "People are wrong about the eastern portion," she said. "Reeves' survey says so. The recovery data says so." She looked at him steadily. "What's the alternative for your dairy?" He looked back at the yard where his wife was still watching. Some conversation passed between them in that look, the kind that married people have without words, compressed and fluent. "What's the fee?" he said. She told him. He was quiet. She watched him do the math against what he was currently spending and see what she already knew he'd see. "Let me look at Reeves' survey," he said. She had a copy. She'd brought a copy. She gave it to him. He read it carefully, the way a man reads something he wants to believe is true and is checking for reasons it might not be. He found none. He closed it and handed it back. "Draw up the agreement," he said. "I'll sign it." She had the agreement drawn up by Farr within 2 days. Hendricks signed. The Alderman brothers took one meeting and signed 3 days after that. A third rancher, a woman named Bess Caraway, who ran sheep on the southern edge, asked for a different arrangement that took another conversation to work out, and signed on the 11th day before Briggs's deadline. 3 signed water agreements, each with its own dated signature, each documenting current or planned use of the Whitaker aquifer. Farr was almost pleased when he reviewed them, which for Farr manifested as a slight reduction in his habitual precision of expression. "This makes the water right functionally active," he said. "Not just a claim. An operating resource with established commercial relationships. The territorial courts look at active use very favorably in rights disputes." He set the agreements down. Briggs can still contest, but his path to winning got considerably narrower today. "Can he still threaten the note extension?" Mae said. "He can threaten, but his note covers a property that now has a documented active water right generating income. The land's value has changed. Any court reviewing a foreclosure action would have to account for that change." Farr looked at her. He'd rather settle than litigate. He doesn't want a prolonged court case with his name on it involving a water rights dispute that attracts scrutiny he's managed to avoid. "How do you know that?" Farr was quiet for a moment. "Because I've dealt with 3 other situations in this territory involving similar structures and similar men. Briggs has a particular pattern." He looked down at the documents. "He depends on people not having representation. He depends on people not knowing what they own. The moment someone does know, and has documentation, and has a lawyer who files correctly, and on time," he gestured at the table, "the path narrows." 10 days left on the extension. Mae was sitting with that number every morning and every night, counting down with the particular grinding awareness of someone whose whole situation fits inside a number that is getting smaller. She was also working. The well development had progressed to the point where water was accessible at a practical depth, and she'd been building the irrigation channels by hand, she and Cole together, at the end of every day that wasn't consumed by legal and documentation work. The eastern field, which had been cracked and brown for as long as she could remember clearly, was showing something in the lowest sections. A darker color in the soil where the water was starting to reach it. A different quality to the surface that was not quite green but was no longer purely dead. Cole noticed it the same day she did. They were working on the channel extension, both of them dirty and tired, late afternoon light going orange, and he stopped and looked at the darkened soil and didn't say anything for a moment. Mae said, "Don't." He looked at her. "Don't what?" "Don't make it into something larger than it is. It's wet dirt." "I know it's wet dirt," he said. "I'm just looking at it." "You've got a particular look on your face." "What kind of look?" She didn't have a word for it. It was the look of a person who'd been betting on something for a while and was seeing the first indication they weren't entirely wrong. It was a vulnerable look, and she recognized it because she'd been trying not to wear it herself. "Just keep digging," she said. He went back to digging. After a moment, she heard him say quietly, not to her exactly, "Your father would have liked to see this." She didn't respond. She kept working. But her hands on the shovel were less steady for a little while after that, and she let herself feel that and then set it aside, the way she'd been setting things aside for 14 months, in a pile somewhere behind her sternum that she'd deal with later when there was time. On the 7th day before the deadline, Briggs made his move. Not through Prescott this time. He came himself, in the morning, to the ranch, with one man Mae didn't know and a document she hadn't anticipated. He knocked on the door with the same even knock he always used, and when Mae opened it, he was standing there with his hat in his hands, which was a studied choice, and his expression was something she'd never seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it, because it was so inconsistent with everything she'd built of him in her mind over these weeks. He looked conciliatory. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I think it's past time we talked properly." She let him in. She didn't offer coffee. She sat across the table and looked at the document he placed in front of her, and something in the back of her throat went cold. It was a purchase offer, not a foreclosure notice. A purchase offer, a price for the Whitaker property, inclusive of water rights, that was nearly 3 times what the land had been worth before the aquifer discovery. She looked at the number. She looked at Briggs. "You're buying," she said. "I'm offering," he said. "There's a difference. You'd walk away from here debt-free with money in hand. More money than this land has ever put in your family's pocket." She sat very still. Cole was in the yard. She could hear him at the equipment shed, and she was glad he wasn't in the room because she needed to think without anyone reading her face. The number on the paper was real. It was substantial. It would clear the debt and leave her with more than a year of living expenses, maybe 2 years if she was careful, and the knowledge that she had done the work that made this land worth 3 times what anyone thought it was worth. She could walk away from Red Hollow. She could go somewhere she wasn't the town's ongoing joke, somewhere no one had watched her pick a deed up from the mud. She looked at the number and let herself feel the pull of it, because it was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. Then she thought about her father writing 2 lines in a ledger 9 years ago. Water table rose this season. Eastern Depression holding, and setting it aside, and never going back. She thought about the darkened soil in the eastern field. She thought about Hendricks and the Alderman brothers, and Bess Caraway with her sheep, all of them dependent now on something that was about to get sold to the man who'd spent 20 years quietly taking what he wanted from this county, while the county called him successful. She picked up the offer document, squared it against the table edge, set it back down in front of Briggs. "No," she said. He looked at her. "That number is fair." "The number is real," she said. "And no." Something moved through his face, not anger, still not that, but something more fundamental. The recalibration of a man who had genuinely not planned for this word. "You're refusing." "I'm refusing," she confirmed. "You have 7 days left on an extension I chose to grant you." "That I negotiated," she said. 7 days in which I intend to make arrangements to service the debt from water agreement revenue. Farr will be in contact with your office about the schedule." Briggs sat back in his chair. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in his office that first day. The new look. The one that was recalculating. But underneath it now there was something else she hadn't seen before. He wasn't certain. For the first time since she'd sat across a table from this man, she could see that he wasn't certain. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You may be right," Mae said. "I've made a few. I'll add this one to the list if it comes to that." He stood, picked up the offer document. His companion, who hadn't said a word the whole time, stood as well. Briggs put his hat on and looked at her one more time, and she thought he was going to say something, but he didn't. He walked out. Cole was in the doorway of the equipment shed when Briggs and his man mounted and rode out. He watched them go without moving. When they were out of sight, he walked across the yard to the house, and Mae was standing in the door. He didn't ask. He looked at her face. "I turned it down," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Big number?" "Yes." He thought about that. "Okay," he said. Okay, she said. He went back to the equipment shed. Mae went back to the table and looked at the notebook and the survey copies and the water agreements. All of it spread out in front of her. All of it the accumulated work of 30-some days and 14 months of not leaving, and 7 days now to close a gap that had been closing steadily but was not yet closed. She thought about what Farr had said. He depends on people not knowing what they own. She knew what she owned. Outside, the afternoon was going toward evening, and somewhere in the eastern field the soil was holding water for the first time in years. 7 days felt different from 25. 25 had been a negotiated space, something she'd fought for and extracted from a man who hadn't wanted to give it. It had the quality of a room with air in it. 7 days was a corridor, narrow and getting narrower, and every morning Mae woke with the number already in her head before she was fully conscious, already counting. She had told Farr about the purchase offer the same evening Briggs left. Farr's response came back the next morning in a letter that was characteristically direct. The offer confirmed that Briggs understood the water right was real, and that contesting it would be expensive and uncertain. A man who files a territorial court challenge does not simultaneously make a purchase offer. He was hedging, which meant he was less certain than he'd been presenting himself. This was useful information. It didn't pay the debt, but it told her something about the terrain. Farr had also been in communication with Briggs's office about the proposed repayment schedule. The plan Mae had outlined in the days following the water agreements, which used projected revenue from the Hendricks contract and the alderman agreements to service the note over an extended period. Briggs's response had been what she expected. The note terms did not provide for extended repayment schedules, and any arrangement outside the original terms required his consent, which he had not given. Which left her, on the morning of the 7th day before the deadline, with the following situation. She had a functioning water source, 3 signed commercial agreements, a water right on record at the territorial office, a lawyer who understood the case, and not enough cash to make the debt payment by the end of the week. She sat with that at the table in the early morning and let it be exactly as bad as it was. Cole came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and sat across from her without saying good morning, which she'd come to understand was his way. He didn't fill mornings with words that weren't necessary. He looked at her face the way he'd gotten good at doing, reading the situation without asking. "How short?" he said. "After the first Hendricks payment, which I can request early, and what's in my father's account? About 40% short." Cole turned his cup in his hands. "That's a lot." "I know what 40% is." He didn't react to the edge. "Is there anything on the property you haven't accounted for?" "I've accounted for everything." "The timber in the northwest corner." She looked at him. She hadn't thought about the timber. "Your father had maybe 3 acres of decent timber up there," Cole said. "I saw it when I walked the full property line last week. It's not old growth, but it's mature. The mill in Mill Haven buys standing timber." Mae thought about those trees. She'd grown up walking through them with her father on Sundays, which was not a sentimental fact but was a true one. Her father had never harvested them, and she'd assumed without ever examining the assumption that there was a reason for that. "How much?" she said. "Depends on the mill's current price, could be significant." She was already thinking past the sentiment, past the memory of Sunday afternoons, into the arithmetic of it. "I'd need a timber assessment." "I can do a rough count today if you want a starting estimate." "Do it," she said. He went. She went to find Farr's copy of the territorial timber pricing schedule that she'd seen referenced in one of his documents, found it, and started calculating. By mid-morning, Cole was back with a count and rough measurements, and she combined that with the pricing numbers, and the result was better than she'd hoped and not quite enough on its own. She needed one more piece. She rode to Mill Haven that afternoon and went directly to the land bank. Not Briggs's bank, a separate institution that had a smaller presence in the county, but existed independently of his operation. She'd done enough reading to know that the land bank offered collateral loans against documented natural resource assets, a relatively new instrument that was becoming more common in the territory as water and timber values rose. The man she needed to see was named Gareth Folsom, and he was the kind of institutional banker who wore his caution like a second coat. careful with language, careful with his hands, careful with his expression, in a way that suggested he'd learned at some point that showing your hand too early was costly. Mae sat across from him and presented what she had: the water right filing, the 3 signed commercial agreements, Reeves' survey, 2 months of recovery rate documentation, the timber assessment Cole had done that morning, and Farr's written summary of the legal situation regarding the Briggs note. She watched Folsom read. He read everything, which took a while, and he made small marks in the margin of his own notepad as he went. When he finished, he squared all her documents and handed them back to her in a neat stack. "You're asking for a collateral loan against the water right and timber assets," he said. "For the specific amount needed to clear the Briggs note," she said. "Not more. The water right is filed but contested. The contest is procedural, not substantive. Farr's assessment. I read Mr. Farr's assessment." Folsom tapped his notepad. "He's a reliable attorney. I've seen his work before." He was quiet for a moment. "The contested status creates risk for us as lender. At what discount would you consider the loan?" He looked at her. He hadn't expected her to ask it that way. She could tell by the slight adjustment in his posture, the recalibration of a man who'd been prepared for a different conversation. "If the water right were uncontested," he said carefully, "the collateral value would support the loan comfortably. Given the contest, I'd need to discount the water right value by roughly 30%. And the timber? Timber assessment is informal. I'd need a certified mill appraisal." "How long for that?" 5 days for our preferred appraiser." She had 7 days. 5 days for the appraisal, 2 days to process. She was inside that margin by hours. "If the timber appraisal comes back within 10% of Cole Mercer's assessment," she said, "does the combined collateral, discounted water right plus timber, cover the loan amount?" Folsom did arithmetic in his head that she could see moving behind his eyes. "Marginally," he said. "Marginally, yes." "Marginally covers it," Mae said. "That's what I need." She rode home with an appointment for the mill appraiser 4 days out and a conditional commitment from Folsom that was as close to a guarantee as careful men like him ever gave. Cole was at the irrigation channel when she got back, extending it another 20 yards toward the northern edge of the field. She stood at the edge of the channel and told him. He listened, his spade resting in the dirt, and when she finished he said, 5 days for the appraisal." "Yes." "And Briggs's deadline is 7. "Yes." "That's tight." "Everything about this has been tight," she said. "Go further north with that channel if you can. I want Hendricks to see it when he comes for the first water delivery." He went further north. She went back inside to write 3 more letters. The days that followed had the compressed quality of time when every hour inside it is doing work. Mae moved through them with the specific focus of someone who has reduced everything in their life to the single problem in front of them and finds, surprisingly, that this reduction is almost peaceful. There was no room for doubt. There was only the next task. The mill appraiser arrived on the 4th day, a lean man with a measuring wheel and a professional indifference to whose land he was on. He spent 3 hours in the Northwest timber and came back with his own notebook. He was 5% above Cole's informal assessment, which made her release a breath she'd been holding since Mill Haven. She sent a rider to Folsom that same afternoon with the appraisal in hand. Folsom's confirmation came back the next morning. The loan was approved, conditional on the note payment clearing the Briggs debt in full, which would be evidenced by Briggs's signed release. That was the day before the deadline. Mae rode to Mill Haven with Cole, collected the bank draft from Folsom. He handed it to her across his desk with the careful neutrality of a man doing his job and being pleased about it in a way he wouldn't say directly, and then rode to Red Hollow. She did not go to Briggs's bank this time. She went to Farr, who was waiting in the office he'd been using at the Hollis place. He reviewed the draft. He reviewed the payoff calculation. He sent a formal notice to Briggs's office that afternoon stating that Mae Whitaker intended to tender full payment of the outstanding note, inclusive of applicable interest, at the First Territorial Bank the following morning, and requesting that Briggs or his representative be present to execute a discharge of the note and a release of the collateral claim. They had dinner that evening at the Hollis place, Mae, Cole, and Farr. A meal that was not celebratory so much as suspended. The thing was not done yet. Briggs could refuse to appear. He could find a procedural objection. He could, in theory, push them into a court filing even at this stage, which would delay the resolution and cost money she'd already committed. Farr said, "He'll appear. His options narrow every day and he knows it. The contested water right starts to look like a losing case once the commercial agreements are established and the collateral loan clears. Courts in this territory have ruled consistently that active use solidifies a discovery claim." He cut a piece of bread. "He'll appear, he'll take the payment, and he'll sign the release. What happens after that is a different question." "What happens after that?" Cole said. "He still controls a significant portion of this county's resources. He still has relationships with the people who run things here. He won't be friendly." Farr looked at Mae. "He also won't be able to touch the water right or the land. Those are secured." Mae said, "I'm not looking for friendly." "I know," Farr said. The next morning, she walked into the First Territorial Bank of Harlan Briggs at 9 o'clock with Cole on her left and Farr on her right. Briggs was already there, standing at the counter with Prescott, not behind his desk this time. He looked at the three of them when they came in, and something in his face was different from all the other times she'd read it. He looked tired. Not physically. He was the same as he'd always been, properly dressed, contained. But behind the containment, there was the particular weariness of a man who had spent the last 25 days expecting something to fall apart that hadn't, and the effort of that expectation had cost something. Mae set the bank draft on the counter. Farr set the payoff calculation beside it. Cole stood back and said nothing. Prescott reviewed the documents with the focused attention of a man doing arithmetic. "He doesn't want to get wrong." He conferred with Briggs in a low voice. Briggs looked at the draft, at the calculation, and then at Mae. "Full payment," Prescott said. "Principal and interest, as calculated." "Yes," Farr said. There was a pause. Mae watched Briggs. He looked at the draft again. His hands were on the counter, relaxed. He had that discipline, at least. She gave him that. He didn't let his body betray him in obvious ways. But she saw the moment he made the decision, which wasn't dramatic. It was just a man accepting an arithmetic reality he'd spent 25 days trying to prevent. "Process the payment," he said to Prescott. Prescott processed. Documents were signed. The discharge of note was executed. The collateral release was signed. Farr reviewed each document before it was countersigned and made 2 corrections to the language in the collateral release, which Prescott rewrote without objection. The whole thing took 40 minutes. When it was done, Mae picked up her copies of the discharge and the release and put them in the folder. Briggs was still at the counter. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was no particular drama in it, no final declaration, no moment of reckoning. He was a man who had lost a property he wanted, and she was the woman who'd kept it, and they both knew the full shape of the thing. "You built something real there," he said. It wasn't generous, it wasn't friendly. It was just a true thing said in the voice of someone who'd been in the business of assessing value for a long time and could recognize it even when it had defeated him. "I know," she said. She walked out. Cole caught up with her halfway down the street. He didn't say anything for half a block. Then he said, "How do you feel?" "Ask me when I've slept," she said. She hadn't slept well in 6 weeks. She didn't sleep particularly well that night either. There was a particular kind of tension that didn't release cleanly just because the crisis had passed, that needed to work itself out over time rather than all at once. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and took inventory, the way she'd been taking inventory since the beginning. What she had, what she needed, what the gap was. The gap was smaller now, significantly smaller. But it wasn't gone. She had the land. She had the water right. She had a functioning well, an irrigation system in early stages, 3 commercial water agreements, and a collateral loan against the timber and the water right that she would need to service from the water agreement revenue. She had 25 days of arrears in her own food expenses that she'd been quietly running on credit at Coulter's. She had a barn roof that still leaked in 2 places. She had 1 horse that was aging and one that was unpredictable, and she had Cole Mercer, who was still sleeping in the barn on a bedroll, and who had never once asked when he was leaving or what the plan was. She owed him $40 she hadn't paid back. She owed him considerably more than that in ways that money didn't describe, which she thought about in the dark and didn't quite know how to account for. 3 days after the payment, Thomas Hendricks came to the ranch for the first formal water access appointment. He brought 2 of his men and the equipment they'd been using for temporary water hauling, and they spent the morning working with Cole on the connection at the property line. Mae watched and took notes and answered questions and did not get out of the way when she was needed. At some point in the mid-morning, Hendricks straightened up from where he'd been working and looked at the irrigation channels running east from the well and at the darkened soil in the eastern field where water was being absorbed, and said something she didn't expect. "Your father would have been proud." She was quiet for a moment. "He might have told me I was doing it wrong," she said. Hendricks looked at her. He'd known Gerald Whitaker. Not well, but enough. "Probably," he said. "That was Gerald's way." A pause. But he'd have been proud underneath it. She went inside when they broke for midday. She stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the deed pinned to the wall above the table. She'd put it there a week ago, after the bank, pressed flat, and let herself feel something she'd been not feeling for 40 days because there hadn't been time and room for it. Relief. And under the relief, grief. The two things that apparently lived in the same neighborhood, because the moment the immediate fear lifted, everything that had been behind it became visible. Her father's 31 years. The two lines in the ledger. The trees in the northwest corner she'd been willing to sell without sentiment, and had felt the sentiment anyway. She stood at the counter for maybe 3 minutes. Then she washed her hands and went back outside. The days that came after had a different quality. Not easy. Nothing about the ranch was easy, but purposeful in a way she hadn't experienced since before her father died. There was work to do, and the work was connected to something growing rather than something shrinking. She got up in the morning with the first light, and the list in her head was a building list rather than a defending list. Cole built the pipeline connections to the property line for the Hendricks delivery point and started on the Alderman connection the following week. He was good with the physical work in the way people are good at things they've done long enough that their body just knows where to put itself. Efficient, not showy, making decisions as they came without requiring much discussion. Mae noticed that about him. He didn't need to ask permission to do the obvious thing. Most men she'd worked around needed to establish that they had authority to do the obvious thing before they did it. Cole just did it. She mentioned this to him one evening. He was repairing the barn roof. The leak, finally. The two places she'd been meaning to get to since March. And she was below handing up materials and thinking out loud more than she usually let herself do. "You don't ask many questions," she said. "I ask when I need to. Most men ask when they want confirmation." He thought about that. "I grew up on a working ranch," he said. "My mother ran it alone for most of my childhood. She didn't have time for permission seeking." He set a shingle and hammered it. "I learned that if something obviously needs doing, you do it and report back." "Your mother sounds practical." "She was the most practical person I ever knew." He reached down for the next shingle without looking. "Also the most stubborn." Mae handed it up. "What happened to the ranch?" "After Colton Adder." A pause. Just long enough that she thought she might have overstepped. Then, "She moved to her sister's place in Colorado. Lived there until she died." He set the shingle. Hammered. "She never went back to land work. That part of her just stopped." Mae was quiet. The hammer sounded twice more. "That's why you came here," she said. Not a question. "Partly." Another shingle. "Partly I'd been moving around long enough that I wanted to see one of these things go the other way. And if it hadn't? If I'd taken the payment offer?" He was quiet for a moment on the roof. "Then I'd have moved on," he said. "That's what you do." She handed up the last shingle without comment. But she thought about that. That's what you do. And the particular weight of it, the history of a person who'd learned to move on from things and had been doing it for long enough that it had become a kind of profession. She thought she understood something about Cole Mercer that she hadn't understood before. In town, things were changing in the way small things in small places change, slowly, in increments, through conversation rather than declaration. People began to nod at her differently. It was subtle enough that she might have imagined it, but she didn't think she had. Martha Ingle told her outright that the story of the bank payment had moved through Red Hollow, like weather. Everyone knew it within 2 days, and everyone had an opinion, and the dominant opinion had shifted from Mae Whitaker being the woman who'd fail at the scald to Mae Whitaker being the woman who'd done something nobody expected. This didn't please Mae as much as she might have anticipated. She'd wanted the land, not the opinion, but she took note of it because it had practical implications. Credit at Coulter's extended more readily, The hardware store held materials she'd ordered without requiring payment up front, and two people stopped her on the street to ask about the water agreements, which told her there might be further commercial opportunity she hadn't fully explored. One of those people was a man named Fuller, who ran a vegetable operation on the eastern side of the county and had been struggling with irregular irrigation for years. The conversation on the street was brief, but she followed up with a letter, and he came to the ranch a week later and walked the property with her and asked questions that told her he understood water systems better than most of the people she'd dealt with. "You'll need more pipeline infrastructure to service my acreage," he said. "I know," she said. "The question is the rate and the timeline." They negotiated. The negotiation took 3 visits and considerable paper and 2 separate arguments about the per-acre rate before they landed on terms they could both live with. Farr reviewed it. Fuller's attorney reviewed it. It was signed on a Tuesday, and Mae put it in the folder with the others and felt the slight increase in the loan servicing security that each new agreement represented. That was the week Cole told her he was thinking about staying. He said it in the way he said most things, plainly, as a piece of information she might want to have, without loading it with more expectation than she'd be comfortable with. "I've been thinking I could be more useful here than somewhere else," he said. They were at the kitchen table, end of day, and the light was going outside, and she had the account book open, and he'd been reviewing the pipeline materials list. "If that's something you'd consider." Mae looked at him across the table. She'd been aware, somewhere in the back of her working mind for the past several weeks, that this conversation was approaching, the way you're aware of weather before you can see it. "What would that look like?" she said. "I'd continue the infrastructure work. The second aquifer shaft you've been planning. I'd build that. The Fuller connection, the expanded Alderman lines." He paused. "If there's a business here, which there is, it needs 2 people to run it properly. You can't do the documentation and the legal management and the field work. I've been doing all 3. "You've been surviving all 3, he said. "That's not the same thing." She thought about that. He wasn't wrong. She'd been running at a pace she could not maintain indefinitely, and she knew it in the way you know things about your own body when you're ignoring them, distantly, in the background, registered and set aside. "You'd need wages," she said. "Eventually, not right now." "That's not a sustainable arrangement." "No," he said. "But the Fuller agreement closes the loan servicing gap. In 2 seasons, if the Eastern Field produces, there's real income here, not just water revenue." He looked at the account book. "Your father was working deadland. You're not working deadland anymore." She looked at the account book too. The numbers were not comfortable. They were better than they'd been. They were on a line that pointed somewhere better rather than somewhere worse. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. 2 days later, she said yes. She said it while she was checking the well measurements, and he was cutting new timber stakes nearby. Said it without stopping what she was doing, and he said okay the same way, and neither of them belabored it. But she was aware. In the days that followed, in the odd domestic rhythm of 2 people working a property together, the particular way a space shifts when a temporary arrangement becomes permanent, she was aware of something settling that had been unsettled. Not resolved exactly. Settled. There was a difference, and she was learning it in real time. The Coulter boy came to the property 3 weeks later. She almost didn't recognize him at first because he came alone and on foot, which was not his usual mode of moving through the world, and without the particular social energy he'd always had around other people. He was just a young man standing at her gate looking uncertain. She went out to the gate. He had his hat in his hands. "Miss Whitaker," he said. "Mr. Coulter." He looked at the ground. "I wanted to say I was sorry about... before. About..." He stopped, started again. "I said some things. Me and some others. About you and the land." Mae looked at him. I was 22, maybe 23, and he had the look of someone who'd had a recent conversation with himself that hadn't been flattering. "What made you come?" she said. Not unkindly. He looked up. "My father." He said, he heard about the bank payment, about the water agreements, and he said, he stopped again. He said we'd made fools of ourselves and we owed you an apology. "Your father's right," Mae said. "Yes, ma'am." She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away, which she gave him credit for. "Come by next week," she said. "If you want to understand what we're doing here with the water system, I'll show you. Your father runs a store. The people who shop there are ranchers. Understanding how water infrastructure works in this county might be useful to him. Coulter looked slightly confused, like he'd come prepared for a harder reception and wasn't sure what to do with this one. "Yes, ma'am," he said again. "Good," she said. "Now go home." Cole was behind her, had come up during the conversation without announcing himself. When Coulter was gone, he said, "That was generous." "It was practical," Mae said. "If the Coulter store understands the value of what we're building, they'll extend credit more readily, and they'll say different things when customers come in." She started back toward the well. "I'm not above being strategic about apologies." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father would have told him to go to hell." "Probably," Mae said. "And he'd have been right to. But I need Coulter's more than I need the satisfaction." She was at the well before she heard him laugh. A short, real sound, the kind that happens before a person can decide whether to suppress it. She didn't turn around, but she was aware of it, the sound of it, in the yard, in the afternoon, on her land. She filed it somewhere behind her sternum next to all the other things she was keeping, and she kept working. 2 months after the bank payment, Harlan Briggs sent a letter through Prescott that was, on its surface, a routine notification regarding the adjustment of his northern range boundary to reflect the corrected survey lines. In practice, it was an acknowledgement that the Whitaker-Oak line boundary now stood on record in a way he could not contest. The letter was professionally worded. It said nothing explicitly. What it communicated implicitly was that a chapter had closed, that he had recalculated, that the Whitaker property was now in a different category in his understanding of the county's resources. Farr sent her a brief note with the letter. "This is what retreat looks like from a man like Briggs. He won't say it plainly. He doesn't have to." Mae put both letters in the folder. The folder was getting thick. She sat at the table that evening with the folder in front of her and her father's deed on the wall above her, and the account book open to a page that was, for the first time in the history of her ownership of this property, not entirely read. Outside, Cole was doing a last check on the new pipeline section, and she could hear him at the water connection, the sound of a person at work on something that was his to work on. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the deed. She thought about what Briggs had said at the bank, the one true thing he'd said the whole time she'd known him. You built something real there. She had. She was. The town would take time. Habits of thought about a person settle in like soil. They compress. They resist disturbance. Red Hollow had a version of Mae Whitaker that it had been working on for a year and a half, and it wasn't going to revise it overnight. She'd get the nods and the extended credit and the Coulter boys coming to apologize, and underneath all of that, the town would still be working out what she actually was, what category she actually belonged in. That was fine. She had time now. She closed the account book. She put the folder away. She got up and lit the lamp against the coming dark. And when Cole came in from the yard, she had already started the supper. The ordinary sound of one day ending inside the much longer project of a life being rebuilt, piece by piece, from ground that everyone had been certain was beyond saving. The second winter on the Whitaker Ranch was the driest anyone in Red Hollow could remember in 30 years. It started in October, when the rains that usually came in off the western range arrived thin and irregular, more suggestion than substance. By November, the creek that ran along the southern edge of the Alderman brothers' property had dropped to a trickle. By December, it had stopped entirely. The older ranchers in the county recognized the pattern from stories their parents had told, the kind of drought that didn't announce itself dramatically, but settled in quietly, week by week, until one morning you looked at your water sources and understood that something fundamental had changed. Mae saw it coming before most people admitted it was coming. She'd been watching the aquifer recovery data every week for 6 months, recording not just the numbers but the rate of change in the numbers. And what she saw in November was a slight but consistent slowing in the recovery cycle. The water was still there. It was still coming back. But the rhythm was different, the way a person's breathing changes before they're sick. Not alarming yet, but information. She brought it to Cole one evening with the notebook open on the table. He studied the numbers for a while. "It's slower," he said, "consistently slower, every week for the past 6. But it's still recovering." "Yes, it's still recovering." She sat down. "The question is what happens if this dry pattern continues into spring. The surface ranches that have been managing on creek water and seasonal ponds are going to hit a wall. If the aquifer slows further under increased draw from our agreements, you need to know the safe yield, Cole said. I need Reeve to come back. Reeve came back in the first week of December, older looking than he'd been a year ago, moving a bit more carefully, but his instruments were the same and his methodology was the same, and his conclusions were characteristically unhedged. He sat at the kitchen table with his assessment written out and walked Mae through it with Cole present and asked no permission to be direct. The aquifer is connected to a regional system, he said, which means it's more resilient than an isolated source. It gets replenishment from a larger network. That's the good news. He turned a page in his notes. The concerning part is that the regional system is showing stress indicators consistent with a drought cycle. Not a season, a cycle. Possibly 2 to 3 years. Mae said, define safe yield under that scenario. You can service your current agreements without damaging the source. You cannot add significant new draw. He looked at her over his reading spectacles. And I'd recommend reducing the Hendricks allocation by 15% through the dry months as a precaution. Hendricks wasn't going to like that. She'd have to manage that conversation carefully. What about the eastern field irrigation? Maintain at current levels. You're not drawing heavily there. The field irrigation is modest compared to the commercial agreements. He closed his notes. The field is actually doing what I'd hoped. The consistent moisture is improving the soil structure. Give it another season and you'll have something you can actually plant. She thanked him and paid him this time. A full fee, no deferral. He accepted it without ceremony and left. After he was gone, Mae sat with the numbers and the conversation for a long while. Cole made coffee and put a cup in front of her and sat down and waited. I have to tell the agreement holders, she said. Yes. Hendricks has dairy cattle that depend on the allocation. I know. The aldermans extended their herd this summer based on the water availability. I know that too. Cole wrapped both hands around his cup. You could not tell them. Manage it quietly on your end and hope the drought eases. She looked at him. I'm not suggesting it, he said. I'm laying out the option so we can set it aside. It's already set aside, she said. I know, he said. She went to Hendricks first, which was the hardest conversation because Hendricks had staked the most. He'd been hauling water for 6 weeks before the Whitaker agreement and had restructured his operations around the new access. Telling him she needed to reduce his allocation, even temporarily, even with a rate adjustment to reflect the reduction, was telling him to replan something he'd already planned. She told him plainly, with the data Reeve had given her, with the aquifer recovery charts, with a written proposal for the adjusted allocation and the rate reduction that went with it. She sat across from him at his kitchen table the way she'd sat across from Briggs and Folsom and Farr, with documentation and directness, and let him read what she'd brought. He read it. He looked at his wife, who was standing at the counter and had been listening to everything. He looked back at Mae. You didn't have to come tell me this, he said. You could have just reduced the flow and let me figure it out. The agreement specifies an allocation amount, Mae said. If I change it, I need your consent and you need to know why. Most people wouldn't have done it this way. I'm not most people, she said, and it didn't come out the way she'd intended. It sounded like a boast, which wasn't what she meant. What I mean is, I know what you mean, Hendricks said. He looked at the proposal again. The rate reduction covers my adjustment costs? It's calculated to, she said. Reeve's estimate for the drought cycle is 2 to 3 years, worst case. If it resolves faster, we go back to full allocation. I'll put that in writing. Hendricks looked at his wife again. This time she nodded, just slightly, the small decisive motion of someone who'd already made up her mind. Draw up the amendment, Hendricks said. I'll sign it. The aldermans were harder. The two brothers ran their ranches as independent operations that had been essentially merged since their father died, and they made decisions together in a way that required both of them to reach the same conclusion simultaneously, which never happened quickly. She spent 3 hours at their properties on a cold December afternoon going back and forth between their two positions, which were not actually that different, but which each brother expressed with the particular conviction of men who'd been disagreeing their whole lives as a form of affection. In the end, they signed. The older brother, Walt, said something as she was leaving that she carried home with her. You know what your father never did, he said. He was standing at his gate and she was already mounted. She waited. He never came to us with a problem and a solution at the same time, Walt said. He'd tell us the problem and then look at us like we were supposed to produce the solution. We never knew quite how to help him. He looked at the ground. You're different that way. She didn't know exactly what to do with that, so she said thank you and rode home and told Cole what Walt had said. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a fair observation about Gerald, he said. You never knew my father. No, but I know the kind of man who leaves 2 lines in a ledger about an aquifer and never follows up. She thought about that. It wasn't unkind, exactly. It was accurate, and accuracy about her father was something she hadn't let many people offer, partly because she'd been protecting him, and partly because she didn't fully trust her own grief to remain stable when examined. He had good instincts, she said finally. He just didn't follow through, Cole said. He didn't have the right tools. Maybe. Cole looked at the newsletter from the Territorial Land Office that had arrived that morning, which he'd been reading. Or he didn't believe enough in what he'd found to put the work in. She looked at him. That's not a criticism, he said. It's the question that matters. Because you could have taken Briggs's offer. Big number, clean exit. You didn't. I know I didn't. Why not? She'd been asked this before by Martha, and obliquely by Farr, and once by Hendricks's wife, who'd put it differently, but meant the same thing. She'd been asked it by herself at the table in the dark enough times. Because it wasn't mine yet, she said. I hadn't earned it yet. Taking his money for the land before I understood what the land was, that would have been giving him the truth about this place, along with the deed. She paused. And I needed to know the truth about it more than I needed the money. Cole looked at her for a moment. That might be the most honest thing you've said about any of this. It might be, she said. January came in hard. The cold settled into Red Hollow with the specific cruelty of a dry winter, where the lack of snow meant the lack of moisture that usually replenished the shallow water sources. And by February, the consequences were becoming visible in the way consequences eventually always are. Not all at once, but in accumulating signs that the people who'd been watching knew how to read. 3 ranches on the northern range ran critically low on water for their cattle. 2 of them were operations Mae had watched over the past year with the particular attention she gave to things she might need to understand. Their sizes, their herd numbers, their infrastructure, the distance from her property line. One was a medium-sized beef operation run by a man named Garth Sully, who'd been in Red Hollow for 15 years and had never, to Mae's knowledge, spoken to her directly. The other was a smaller operation belonging to a widow named Clara Petch, who'd lost her husband 2 summers ago and had been running things alone since, with 2 teenage sons doing the labor. Clara Petch came to Mae's gate on a Tuesday morning in February. Mae heard her coming and went out, and Clara was standing at the gate with her hat against her chest and the expression of someone who'd rehearsed this on the ride over and was hoping the rehearsal was good enough. Mrs. Petch, Mae said. Miss Whitaker. Clara's voice was steady, but only barely. I've got 20 head going dry. My seasonal pond is gone and the creek's been empty for a month. I'm hauling from Millhaven, but the cost. She stopped. I know we haven't spoken much before. I know there's no reason you'd... Come in, Mae said. Clara looked surprised. Maybe she'd expected more resistance. Maybe she'd expected to have to work harder for the threshold. Mae brought her inside and put coffee in front of her and got out Reeves' assessment and the current aquifer data and laid it on the table. Here's what I have, she said. Here's what I can offer and what I can't, and why. I'm going to be straight with you because it's the only way to have a conversation that's worth having. She explained the aquifer situation, the drought cycle, the safe yield, the existing agreements and their adjusted allocations. She explained what a new agreement could look like under the current constraints and what it would cost and what it would provide. Clara Petch listened. She was a woman who'd been running a cattle operation alone for 2 years, and she listened the way such a person listens, carefully, without interrupting, making her own calculations behind her eyes. When Mae finished, Clara said, Can you do it? With a small new allocation, yes. Within the safe yield. Then I'd like the agreement. I'll need Farr to draw it up. 3 days. I can manage 3 days. Clara looked at the documents on the table. You've kept real careful records. You have to, Mae said. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. That's what I've learned. Clara was quiet for a moment. I heard about Briggs, the bank payment. She looked at her coffee cup. I didn't say anything at the time. I should have. What he did to you in the street, it's past, Mae said. It's not past for me, Clara said. I watched it happen, and I walked the other way. I've got daughters. I think about that. She looked up. I just wanted to say it. Mae held her eyes. Thank you, she said, and meant it without complication, which was something she was getting better at. Garth Sully came 4 days after Clara, and his arrival was less graceful. He came on horseback with 2 of his men, which was the kind of approach that was meant to communicate something, and he stood at her gate with the posture of a man who was used to having weight in a conversation and was putting it out there early. Mae came to the gate and waited. I need water access, he said. No greeting. My northern herd is critical. I have a standard agreement process, Mae said. I can have terms drawn up within the week. I need it faster than that. I can give you emergency access for 2 weeks at a standard rate while FAR draws up the formal agreement. You'd need to sign a letter of intent today. Sully looked at her. He was assessing something, trying to determine whether she was negotiating or whether this was actually how things worked here. You charge for emergency access? I charge for all access, Mae said. The aquifer is a resource, not a favor. He was quiet. One of his men shifted in his saddle. The morning was cold, and the 3 of them on horseback and Mae at the gate made a picture that she was aware of, the specific visual of a woman holding a line against people who were accustomed to lines not holding. Fine, Sully said. Send someone with the letter of intent and I'll sign it. I'll bring it myself this afternoon, she said, and I'll need to see your herd situation to assess what allocation is appropriate. He blinked. You're coming to assess my operation. I need to allocate correctly. If I over-allocate to one agreement, I damage the yield for others. I have responsibilities to existing agreement holders. Another pause. Then, roughly, this afternoon then. She brought Cole with her, partly because the assessment was a 2-person job, and partly because she wasn't above the practical reality that arriving at Garth Sully's ranch alone with a letter he hadn't seen yet was an unnecessary complication. Sully's men watched Cole with the assessment that men give to other men they're trying to categorize, and Cole gave them the same steady, unreadable neutrality. He gave everyone, which Mae had come to understand was not a performance but simply his actual state. Sully signed the letter of intent at his kitchen table with a pen held too tightly, which was fine. Mae didn't need him to like it. The Petch and Sully agreements, when formally signed, brought the water agreements to 6. 6 operations dependent on the Whitaker aquifer, 6 revenue streams servicing the collateral loan, 6 sets of people whose operations were now materially connected to the health of a piece of land that had been called dead for as long as anyone in Red Hollow could remember. Farr came out from Colebrook in March to review the full agreement portfolio and sat at the kitchen table with his reading spectacles and went through everything with the focused pleasure of a man whose professional instincts had been confirmed. You've built a water utility, he said, looking at the 6 agreements. That's a large word for a well and some pipe, Mae said. The structure is what matters, not the scale. He set the agreements down. Legally, you have an established water service operation. That changes how the law treats you and how courts would treat any challenge. He looked at her over his glasses. Briggs cannot challenge this as a disputed claim anymore. It's a functioning business. Cole said, Can he come at it from another direction? Farr considered. He'd have to find something in the filing or the agreements. I've reviewed both and there's nothing to find. He looked at Mae. The question at this point isn't whether he can hurt you. It's whether he decides it's worth the cost to try. What's your read? My read is that Harlan Briggs is a businessman, Farr said. What you've built is now more valuable intact than disrupted. Disrupting it creates litigation, scrutiny, and uncertainty. Men like Briggs avoid all 3 when they can. He picked up his pen and made a note. I think he's done. Mae sat with that. Done. It was a strange word for the end of something that had consumed most of her conscious energy for over a year. She'd expected done to feel more conclusive, the way the end of a storm feels. Sudden, clear, a different quality to the air. But done, when it came, felt more like a gradual thinning. One morning you realize you haven't thought about the threat in 3 days, and then you realize that absence has been true for a week, and then you understand that the weight you'd been carrying had been leaving in increments you hadn't tracked. She walked far to his horse when he left. At the gate he turned and said, For what it's worth, Miss Whitaker, I've handled a lot of cases in this territory, some of them more legally complex than yours. but I've rarely seen someone under that kind of pressure think as clearly as you did. I made mistakes, she said. Yes, you also corrected them. He put on his hat. That's not the same as not making them, but it's the thing that actually matters. He rode out. She stood at the gate for a while after he left, in the cold March air, looking at the property. The roof on the barn that didn't leak anymore, the irrigation channels running east, the well housing Cole had built properly in October to replace the rough test setup, the northwest corner where the timber still stood because the loan had been serviced from other revenue, and she hadn't needed to sell it. She'd thought about selling the timber many times in the months since, done the arithmetic of it, but every time she reached the same conclusion, the timber was holding something in the northwest corner that was harder to quantify than board feet, some anchor she wasn't ready to lift. That evening, she told Cole what Farr had said. Cole was at the table with the pipeline maintenance schedule, which he'd been reorganizing. He listened. He said, "He's right." "About which part?" "All of it." He set down his pencil. "But especially that Briggs is done." He looked at the schedule. "He sent an inquiry through his people about the Caraway connection last month. Did you know that?" Mae stared at him. He inquired about Bess Caraway's agreement? He wanted to know the terms. Bess mentioned it to me when I was out there adjusting her line. She told him it was her business, which it is. Cole's expression didn't change, but his voice had something in it she recognized. The particular flatness of someone saying a true thing that has an edge on it. He was looking for a crack, something he could leverage. Caraway's smart. She shut it down immediately. "You didn't tell me." "I just did." She sat with that. "He's still looking." "He's still looking," Cole agreed. "But looking isn't the same as finding. The agreements are solid. The filing is solid. There's nothing to find. He might make something. He might try." Cole looked at her steadily. "That's different from succeeding. A year ago, he could have moved against you with very little resistance. Now you'd take him to territorial court with 6 signed agreements, a water right on record, and Farr." A pause. "That's not the same fight." She knew he was right. She also knew that knowing Briggs was still looking was different from believing it didn't matter, and that the difference lived in her body rather than her mind. A vigilance she'd built over the course of that year that didn't simply switch off because the legal situation had changed. She'd probably carry some version of it indefinitely. That was the tax. Not the only tax, but one of them. Spring came late and dry and then turned, in April, toward something better. The rains came in off the range in the second week of the month. Not dramatically, not the end of the drought, but a meaningful shift. 3 days of steady rain that raised the creek levels and pushed the aquifer recovery rate up noticeably in the days afterward. Mae measured the well every morning the way she had for a year, recording the data. And when she saw the recovery rate numbers in the week after the rain, she sat with the notebook for a long time before she put it down. She went out to the eastern field. The field had been changing for 6 months in the way slow things change, each individual day looking more or less like the day before, the progress visible only when you spanned a longer period in your mind. She'd been doing that spanning regularly, comparing what she saw now to the cracked brown surface she'd stood over with an iron rod in the autumn of last year, looking for something she wasn't sure existed. What she saw in April, after the rain, was green. Not the tentative possible green of damp soil that might or might not amount to something. Actual green, the earliest grass pushing up through soil that had been transformed by 6 months of consistent subsurface moisture into something that could hold and feed a root. She stood at the edge of the field for a long time. Cole came and stood beside her. He'd seen it too. She could tell by the particular quality of his silence, which was different from his working silence. "Don't," she said preemptively. "I'm not saying anything," he said. "You have that look again." "What look?" She looked at him. He looked back at her with the specific expression she'd tried to find words for once before and hadn't quite managed. The look of a person who'd been betting on something for a long time and was no longer uncertain they'd bet right. It was a vulnerable expression, and he wore it without apology, which was somehow the most disarming thing about it. "That look," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father was right about this field." He was. He just needed more time than he had. She looked back at the green. "Or someone to keep going after he stopped," she said. That landed differently than she'd intended. Or maybe exactly as she'd intended, she wasn't sure. She'd been saying things lately that had more layers than she meant to put in them. And she wasn't always certain whether that was something she was doing deliberately or something that was simply happening, the way a lot of things had simply happened over the past year without her fully planning them. "I'm going to plant the eastern field this season," she said. "I figured. It's too late in the year for a full crop, but I can put in test rows, see how the soil performs under actual cultivation." "What do you want to plant?" She'd been thinking about this for weeks. She'd talked to Fuller about it, to the Alderman brothers, to Martha Ingle, who had opinions about everything including what grew in the county's particular soil. She'd read 3 different pamphlets from the Territorial Agricultural Office. She had a list. "Sorghum in the driest sections," she said. "It's drought tolerant. It'll tell me how the soil handles heat. Alfalfa near the irrigation channel. It improves the soil structure, and I can sell it to the dairy operations." She paused. "And along the northern fence, I want to try kitchen garden vegetables. Fuller has a market contact in Mill Haven who handles vegetables. Small test. See what the soil does." Cole looked at the field. "That's 3 different cultivation strategies in one season." "I want data," she said, "not just hope." "You've been saying that for a year." "It's worked out reasonably well," she said, and he almost smiled, which was as close as he got most days. They planted in May. It was hard physical work, more than 2 people could do quickly, and she hired 2 men from town for 3 weeks. One of them, the older Coulter son, who'd been coming around since his brother's apology, and who turned out to be a surprisingly diligent worker when removed from the social context that had always made him a fool. She paid them in cash at the end of each week, which she was able to do because the water agreement revenue had been reliable for 4 months, and the loan service was current. She also hired a woman named Dot Reyes, who was 38 and had been doing seasonal work across 4 different ranches in the county for as long as anyone could remember, and who proved within the first 2 days to have more practical knowledge about soil cultivation than anyone Mae had spoken to since Reeve. Dot had opinions, and she delivered them plainly, and Mae listened to all of them and accepted about half, which Dot seemed to consider a satisfactory ratio. "Most people hire me and then ignore what I say," Dot told her one afternoon in the field. "That seems wasteful," Mae said. "It is," Dot said. "You want my opinion on the northern fence rows?" "I want your opinion on all of it," Mae said. Dot stayed through July. Red Hollow was watching all of this. Mae was aware of it the way she'd always been aware of the town's attention. Not constantly, not anxiously, but with the background knowledge that a small community watches its members, the way weather watches a landscape, shaping and being shaped without formal acknowledgement. The watching had changed in quality. She couldn't have described the change precisely, but she felt it in the concrete ways. In the credit extended, in the conversations that no longer stopped when she approached, in the people who came to the gate now not with apologies but with questions. The questions were the thing that surprised her most. Ranchers she'd barely spoken to before asked about the irrigation design. Wives of men who'd laughed at the Coulter boys' jokes asked about the alfalfa, about whether she'd considered rotating crops, about what Reeves' assessment said about the soil pH. A young man who was just starting out, 20 years old, came to ask if he could look at the well system because he was hoping to develop his family's property and didn't know where to start. She spent an hour with him. She showed him the test shaft, the casing design, the recovery documentation. She pulled out the pamphlets from the Territorial Agricultural Office and gave him 3 of them. He looked at the pamphlets and then at her. "Why are you helping me?" he said. "I don't have anything to offer you." She thought about that for a moment. About Aldous Reeve coming out for no immediate payment. About Cole appearing at her door with tools and knowledge and 8 years of his own history. About Martha Ingle and her coffee in the back room and her commentary on flower portions. "Nobody gets anywhere alone," she said. "That's the truth this land taught me. Your father couldn't. Mine couldn't." She handed him one more pamphlet. "Take those and come back when you've read them. We'll talk about what your soil situation actually is." He came back. He brought his father, who was a quiet man with the look of someone who'd been struggling for a long time and had almost stopped believing there was another way. Mae sat with both of them at the kitchen table and went through everything plainly and without condescension. And when they left 2 hours later, the father stopped at the gate and looked back at the ranch, at the green field and the well housing and the pipeline connections, and something moved across his face that she recognized. Hope, trying to be realistic about itself. The most careful, the most hard-won kind. In August, Harlan Briggs had a stroke. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing about it was, which was perhaps the strangest part. He was at his desk at the bank when it happened, mid-morning, and was found by Prescott 20 minutes later. He survived. He spent 6 weeks recovering at his home outside of town, and when he returned to public life, he was slower and walked with a cane. And the word was that he was transferring management of the bank and his primary operations to his nephew, a younger man from the East who had no particular history in Red Hollow and no particular investment in the long-running arrangements Briggs had maintained. Mae heard all of this from Martha, who heard it from 3 different sources in the same week. "Does it change anything for you?" Martha asked. Mae considered the question honestly. "The threat was already mostly gone," she said. "Farr said it months ago. Briggs wasn't going to move against us. But knowing there's someone in that bank who doesn't have 30 years of accumulated grievance against me," she paused. "Yes, that changes something, even if I can't name it precisely." Martha was quiet for a moment, sorting mail. "Are you going to go see him?" Mae looked at her. "Briggs? He's an old man who had a stroke." "He's a man who dropped my father's deed in the mud," Mae said, "and tried to take the land from me through every angle he could find for a year." "Yes," Martha said. "And?" Mae was quiet. Martha kept sorting. "I'll think about it," Mae said, which was not the same as no, and Martha knew that, which was why she didn't push further. She did think about it. She thought about it for 2 weeks, in the early mornings at the table and in the evenings when the work was done, turning it over the way you turn over a problem that doesn't have a clean solution. She didn't want to forgive Briggs in the way that forgiveness gets described. The dramatic, generous act, the release of grievance as a gift to the other person. That felt false to her, and she didn't have false available in sufficient quantity. But she thought about what the past year had actually been. She'd spent it building something. She'd spent it proving something. And every hour she spent carrying Harlan Briggs's presence in her chest was an hour that belonged to him rather than to what she'd built. She rode to his house on a Wednesday afternoon in September. Cole knew where she was going, she'd told him that morning, and he'd said nothing beyond okay, which was the right thing to say. Briggs was on his porch when she arrived. It was thinner, and the cane was leaning against the railing beside him, and he watched her ride up with an expression she couldn't read from a distance. She tied the horse and came up the steps and stood in front of him. He looked at her for a moment. "Miss Whitaker," he said. His voice was slightly different. The stroke had taken something from its edges. "Mr. Briggs," she said. She sat down in the other chair without being invited, which felt appropriate. "I'm not here to make peace with you," she said. "I want to be clear about that." He looked almost amused. "Then why are you here?" "Because I didn't want the last thing I said to you to be what I said in the bank." She looked at him directly. "You tried to take my land. You used the town's opinion of me as a tool. You tried to complicate the water right and the boundary and the note terms simultaneously and hoped I wouldn't have the resources to fight all of it." She paused. "You did all of that and it didn't work? And I want you to know that I know it didn't work not because of luck or because someone rescued me. It didn't work because I understood the land better than you did, and I was willing to do the work to prove it." Briggs looked at her. His hands were in his lap, and the afternoon light was the long gold of early autumn. "You're right," he said, "about all of it." She waited for more. There wasn't more. He said it simply, the way a man says something when he no longer has the energy for anything except the true thing. She sat with that for a moment. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It wasn't the clean feeling she might have anticipated a year ago when she was at the table in the dark counting days. It was something more complicated, the recognition that there was nothing more to extract from this, that the account was as settled as it was going to be, and that settled was enough. "Your nephew," she said. "Is he someone I can work with?" Briggs blinked, clearly not the direction he'd expected the conversation to go. "He's straightforward," he said after a moment. "Different from me." "Good," Mae said. She stood. "The Whitaker offer services 6 operations in this county. In 2 seasons, it'll service more. That's a significant piece of the county's water infrastructure. If the bank is interested in being a constructive part of that, there are ways to structure that conversation." She picked up her hat. "If it's not interested, that's fine too, but I thought you should know where things stand." She went down the steps and untied her horse. At the gate she heard him say her name. Not Miss Whitaker, just Mae, the first time he'd used it. She turned. He was looking at her from the porch with the expression she'd never seen on him before. The one that had shown up briefly when he made the purchase offer. The recalibration of a man who'd been certain and then hadn't been. "You're going to be a problem for a lot of people," he said. "For a long time." "I know," she said. She rode home. Cole was at the well when she got back, doing the evening measurement. He looked up when she came into the yard, and she tied the horse and went and stood beside him and looked at the notebook in his hand. "Recovery rate is up again," he said. "Third week running." She looked at the number. It was the strongest since the drought started. "The aldermans can go back to full allocation next month," she said. "I'll tell them." She took the notebook and wrote the date and the number in her own hand, the way she'd been doing every day for over a year, and handed it back. "Cole," she said. He looked at her. She'd been turning over what she wanted to say for a while, in the same careful way she'd turned over the visit to Briggs, looking for the version of it that was true without being more than she actually meant. She wasn't a person who said more than she meant. She wasn't going to start. "What you did?" she started. "Coming here. Staying." She looked at the well, at the pipeline, at the east field where the test crops had come up better than she'd dared to expect. "I don't have a clean way to account for it. You know that." "I know," he said. "The $40? May. I'll pay it back." "I know you will." He wasn't looking at the field or the well. He was looking at her in the way he'd looked at her across the table at 2 in the morning, the night he rode back from Colebrook, the way he'd looked at the Eastern Depression the first morning, the way he looked at things he was trying to understand fully before he decided anything. "That's not what it is." "I know what it is," she said. "I just don't have words for it yet." "That's okay," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. He meant it the way he always meant things, plainly, as information, without decoration. "No," she said. "You're not." The evening came in slowly, the way autumn evenings do on the plains. Not suddenly dark, but gradual, the light going amber and then rose and then something almost purple over the western range before it gave way. May stood at the well in that light and looked at what a year had built. Not what she'd imagined. Nothing was ever what you imagined. The irrigation system didn't run quite as cleanly as the design suggested it should, and there were 2 sections of the pipeline that needed attention before winter, and the northern fence still had 3 posts that would need replacing in spring. The eastern field had come up green, but not uniformly. There were sections where the soil was still resistant, still working out what it was supposed to be. None of it was finished. None of it was supposed to be finished. A working ranch is never finished. It's a system that requires ongoing attention, ongoing decision-making, ongoing willingness to look at what isn't working and address it without flinching. She understood that now in her body the way she hadn't when she first came back to this land, when she'd been looking for the moment when everything would be resolved and she could rest. There was no such moment. The rest you got was what you built between the problems, and the hours when the work was going, and the light was good and the person working beside you was someone you trusted. She had that. She had it today, specifically, and she intended to have it tomorrow. What she'd learned on the Scald, and she thought about this sometimes, in the quiet, in a way she couldn't have anticipated when she was crouching in the mud picking up her father's deed. What she'd learned was something about the nature of strength that the town of Red Hollow had never taught her. Red Hollow understood strength as a quality you declared, a reputation you maintained, a posture you held in public. It understood strength as the absence of visible struggle. What May had found in the notebooks and the test holes and the 2 in the morning arithmetic and the long silences at the table when the numbers didn't add up, what she'd found was that actual strength had no interest in being seen. It didn't perform. It didn't wait for the town to change its opinion before it went back to work. It showed up before light and stayed after dark, and it argued with the water rights attorney, and it rode 20 miles to find a lawyer. It wasn't sure would help, and it said no to a large number and went back to the field. Strength, she had learned, was mostly just not stopping. Not when the deed was in the mud, not when the clock was down to 7 days, not when the town was laughing, not when everything in the situation told you the reasonable thing to do was leave. Staying when leaving was available. That was the thing. That was the only thing. Her father had stayed for 31 years. He hadn't always known what he was staying for, hadn't always had the tools to follow through on what he found. But he'd stayed, and that staying had kept the land, and the land had kept the aquifer, and the aquifer had given her something to find when she came back. She didn't know that he'd known any of this. She thought probably he hadn't. She thought he'd just stayed because it was his, and because leaving felt like losing, and because some part of him believed, without evidence, that the land was not yet finished with him. She understood that now. She understood him better in that particular way than she had when he was alive, which was one of the taxes of losing someone, the understanding that comes after, too late to tell them. She would tell the field instead. She would tell it with sorghum and alfalfa and kitchen garden rows and another season's worth of irrigation and careful documentation, and the field would respond in the way things respond when you pay them proper attention, which is slowly, imperfectly, and more surely than you expected. The light finished going. The stars came out over the scald, which had not been the scald for some time now, which was the Whitaker Ranch again, the way it had been before anyone had started calling it by the name of what it lacked. Cole walked back toward the house. Mae stayed a moment longer at the well. She looked at the sky, at the field, at the dark line of the oak trees on the northern boundary, standing exactly where they'd always stood, patient and unhurried, marking a line that had been there all along, waiting for someone to know it was theirs. She knew.